Hey, this is Tim Corey, and I want to introduce my new C Sharp application from start to finish course. In this course, I'm going to show you step by step how to take an application from its idea stage all the way through being built. So the idea for this application is that our friend wants us to build a tournament tracker, something that can be used to track a game tournament of some kind. For example, in America, we just finished the NCAA basketball March Madness tournament. In it, 64 teams play through 6 rounds of single elimination games to determine the champion. The brackets look like this. Now, if you're outside the US, you might be more familiar with the elimination portion of the World Cup. After the group stage, the remaining teams play single elimination games to determine the eventual winner. Our friend wants an application that can run these type of tournaments. So think office tournaments or recreational league tournaments. And that's what we're building. So now let's discuss the technologies that we're going to end up using in this course. We arrive at the conclusion that a WinForm application is probably our best for now, but we also set everything up to be easily changed over to an ASP.NET MVC application or a WPF application or something else entirely. We don't want to commit to a single database solution either, so we end up building 2 different types of data storage, both Microsoft SQL Server as well as text file storage. Now, other technologies included are Dapper. We do a lot of LINQ. We do a lot with interfaces, especially with our data storage, since we store in either SQL or text files. And the way I flip that over is easily done using interfaces. We don't actually ever talk directly to the code that writes the SQL or to the text files. Also, we do emailing from C#. We have custom events, and we even get into advanced debugging in this course. And the reason why is because everything is done on screen. And so sometimes you have bugs in your application. Well, we have bugs too, and we're going to fix them on screen. Welcome to Lesson 1 of C# from start to finish. Today, we're going to get our scenario and start our initial planning of the project. So let's jump right in. So here's our scenario. We had a friend come to us and say, I want you to create a tournament tracker. We've got this office pool and we want to play each other in a way that can determine who's the best. So we're going to create a bracket system and we're going to have the computer tell us who to play in a single elimination style bracket. So at the end, the winner should come out on top, the person who's won all the games. So the model is the NCAA basketball tournament bracket for March Madness. So that's the basic scenario that our friend comes to us with. And that isn't enough to start the application, but it's enough for us to start planning. The first place you should always start is with requirements. Now you may say, I understand what the application is, I should just start figuring out how the code's going to work. That's really the first rookie mistake that you'll make, is the idea of, I know what the application should do, so I should start by coding. And really, we're going to put off coding for about 5 or 6 lessons. And the reason why is because if we set a good foundation now, it'll make coding so much easier and we'll have less bugs. So trust me, this is important. So let's start off with the requirements and kind of flesh out what we've been given so far. So far we know we need to track games played and their outcome. So who won? So imagine you have 4 players playing and we'll have 2 games played and the winners of those 2 games play each other, and then that winner would be the winner of the overall bracket. That's kind of what we're going to do. We're going to track those games that have been played and their outcome so we know who won, so we know who goes to the next round. We're also going to have multiple competitors. I mean, that sounds obvious, but you really need to have it down on paper. Next, we're going to create a tournament plan. Who plays in what order? It's not that we're given a list of who's going to play. We have to determine who gets to play and when. And then we need to schedule games. How do we schedule games? That's not been specified. But we know that we have to have some kind of list of these are the people to play and what order. We do know that a single loss eliminates a player from the tournament. We also know that the last person standing is the winner. So after all the games have been played, we should have one person left standing at the end. That's the winner. And that's really all the requirements we've built so far. There's not a whole lot more to it yet, which means that the next thing we should do is ask a set of questions. We need to find out what the full requirements are. Because here's the deal with any project, whether this is a personal project, a project for a friend, or a project at work. There are always more requirements than what are specified. Your friend is not trying to hide information from you, but they have an idea in their mind and they don't always fully communicate it. In fact, they never fully communicate it. And so you have to kind of pull out what those requirements are and also what are the things they really don't care about. So let's go through and I'm going to give you my list of questions that I have out of this scenario. Let's start with question 1. How many players will a tournament handle? Is it variable? See, that's not something that's been specified. They've said, we want to do a tournament, we want to have a number of people play, but if it's a fixed number of people, that's important to know. The NCAA tournament is a fixed number of teams. It's 68 teams, actually. The bracket's 64, but they put 4 more on. So they have a fixed bracket. But I'm thinking maybe this might not be a fixed bracket. But we don't know for sure. We need to make sure by asking the question. Number 2, if a tournament has less than the full complement of players, how do we handle it? For example, if in my previous example I said, 4 players play, then the 2 winners of those games play each other, and that final winner is the overall winner. But what happens if we had 3 players? How do we do that? Or in the case of the NCAA bracket, what if they had 67 teams or 63 teams? Again, I have an idea of how we can handle this. Most tournaments like this have the idea of what's called a bye, which means that certain teams don't play in the first round. Instead, what happens is they have a first round bye, it's called, where they get a free pass. So they automatically get put into the next round. Now, we can explain more how that would work if that's what we're thinking we're going to do. But again, this comes back to requirements. Maybe they come back and say, no, you know what? We're always going to have the correct or the full number of players. If you're not familiar with brackets, what that would be is a multiple of 2. So 2 people would work, 4 people would work, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, and so on. Numbers outside of that could cause a problem unless we've prepared ourselves for how we're going to handle it, or just say we don't allow it. Number 3, should the ordering of who plays each other be random or ordered by input order? This is another key thing to think about. When we're looking at who plays who, maybe the tournament organizers want to put that in some kind of order, or maybe we just want to randomize it. I would think we'd want to randomize it, but we really need to ask. Number 4, should we schedule the game, or they just play whenever? So here's the idea. If we have, say, 2 games in the first round, do we just say you play them whenever you want to play them, and when both have been played, then we do the next round? Or do you say the first game is played at 9:30 a.m. on a Friday, and the second game is played at 9:30 a.m. on a Monday? We have to understand what they're envisioning for the system. All right, next, if the games are scheduled, how does the system know when to schedule the games for? Do we say the games are 20 minutes long and we're going to start at this time and end when we're done the tournament? Or do we say, here's the open available time slots we have and the games are this long, fill up what you can, and then continue day after day until the tournament's done? How does that work? But that question is only valid if we're going to schedule the games. Okay, so that's the first 5. But guess what? I got more questions. If the games are played whenever, can a game from the second round be played before the first round is complete? Okay, so this won't work real well with my example of 2 games in the first round, 1 game in the second round. But what if we had a pre-round, where the true first round is 4 games, and then the next round is 2 games, and the round after that is 1 game? So in that case, if 2 of those 4 games are played already, and those 2 winners happen to be playing each other in the next round, can they go ahead and do round 2 before the other 4 teams play each other to determine who plays the other game in that second round? We got to figure that out in order to know what we can allow people to do and not allow people to do if they can play whenever. Again, if we're going to schedule the games, this doesn't matter. Next question. Does a system need to store a score of some kind or just who won? So this is what I'm thinking. Maybe we want to have more than just you won or you lost. Maybe we want to have some kind of information about what the score was. Maybe for more prizes at the end. Say highest point differential or closest win or luckiest player, something like that. Or just to have, here's all my scores. Do you want to store that or not? All right, question 8. What type of front end should the system have? Is it just a form like a WinForm application? Is it a website or a web page? Is it a phone app of some kind? For those of you that want to jump right into coding, that'd be your first hurdle, is we never really specified. Then the temptation is rookie mistake number 2, which is assumptions. That's a huge mistake. Don't ever assume if you don't have to. If we just jumped in and started coding, we'd have to assume what type of front end it is, or we'd have to ask the question, which is what we're doing here. It's just we're being intentional about it instead of being, oops, we have to find out more information. Next question, where is the data going to be stored? That's really important to know. We're going to generate a lot of data. We're assuming, and again, that's an assumption, but we're assuming that the application won't be running the entire tournament. Maybe it will. Maybe it won't store any data. But that question will spark that thought in the mind of the owner, the person who asked for this project, also known as a stakeholder, and we'll call that person stakeholder from now on. So the person that wants this tournament tracker created is our stakeholder, and they would know, do we want to store data? And either tell us where they want it stored or say, can you help me determine where we should store it? But that question will generate that conversation. All right, next question. Will this system handle entry fees, prizes, or other payouts? Usually when you have a tournament, you have some type of reward. Now maybe that reward is just, hey, you won, but maybe it's something more substantial. For example, if every player paid $10, then the winner could have, say, half of the overall income from the tournament. So 8 players in the tournament, they each pay $10. Winner takes $40. The second place person takes $20. And we could go on down from there. So the question is, are we going to do that? We're going to have entry fees. We're going to have prizes. We could have prizes without entry fees. We could have entry fees without prizes. We could have other payouts. But the important thing here is we ask the question. All right, so that's question number 10. We're done, right? No, we got even more questions. Okay, next question. What type of reporting is needed? We're going to win this tournament. The person's going to go through and win this tournament. Do we tell them they won? Do they just know? Do we have some type of scorecard, or do we let everyone know here's the results of the tournament? What do we tell them? Like, is it just Bob won? Or is it the results of round 1 are in and here's the wins and losses with the scores? What do we need to know? So that's that question. It's a pretty broad question, but again, it's to spark that conversation that needs to happen. Who can fill in the results of a game? Are we going to allow anybody to say who won, who lost? Are we going to lock it down to you can only report on your game, or you can only report your score, or the administrator does everything and doesn't allow anybody to touch anything? What's this going to be like? Next question. Are there varying levels of access? And that kind of goes along with question 12, but what we're asking here is, do we have some people that can do certain things or see certain things and others that have more access? We have to have someone who has administrator access, the ability to create a tournament, and then also to enter information. But do we want to have a user that can just see the tournament? Maybe we want a view that's just the read-only view. That'd be a varying level of access. So do we need that? Or is it just that whoever uses the application can see and do everything? Number 14, should this system contact users about upcoming games? Now think about it. How would you know that you're going to play a game? How do you know that we're all the way through or most of the way through round 1 and your game's up next? We have to let them know somehow. Maybe the tournament administrator just lets everybody know manually. That seems counterintuitive, especially since we're creating an application right now. And this is probably one of those questions that your friend doesn't even have a thought about yet. They haven't thought, oh, how do we let people know? They just want to create a tournament tracker. So this question is probably going to spark a discussion of what's possible, what's available. And from that, you can kind of flesh out more of these requirements, or maybe more of the features that are nice to have or would like to have in the future, but aren't really necessary for now. And the last question I came up with is each player on their own, or can teams use this tournament tracker? So for example, if this was a doubles tennis tournament, there's not just one person, there's 2 people on a doubles team. So are we going to record that, or is it just the team captain or the random person who came in first that we put the team in their name? That's a question that could be asked. My thought is, again, they use the example of the NCAA basketball tournament, the March Madness bracket. Well, a basketball team isn't just one person. It would be all 12 people or all, at least the 5 starters. Okay, we're talking about probably an office situation or a group of friends. So maybe it's not, 12 people to a team, but maybe it's a 3-on-3 basketball tournament, in which case a team of 3. Or maybe it's just a ping pong tournament and each person is on their own. So the question is, can this tournament tracker handle both? Should it handle both? Do you want it to handle both? Or are we saying that we're going to lock it into a certain avenue, a certain type of setup? And that, believe it or not, is all the questions that I came up with. Now, are there more that I could probably ask? Probably. I'm sure that as we get into this application, we're going to find out, we should have asked that, and we'll need to go back to the stakeholder. But those are the questions that I came up with that I thought, these are the things that I'd ask right away up front to get some clarity on how this application should be built and what general direction I need to go. Now, I'm going to say this probably multiple times throughout this course, but don't stress out about, I have to be perfect here. But do work hard to get as much as possible up front. The more you have up front, the more likely it is that you set yourself up for success down the road. And with that, we're done with all the questions. And we're also done with lesson 1. We've gone over the requirements and we've kind of asked those questions to expand the requirements to what we need to know in order to get started. Welcome to lesson number 2 in the C# from start to finish course. My name is Tim Corey, and today we're going to be looking at the overview planning, the big idea or the big picture of our application, kind of laying out just the foundation of it. Really, this should be a pretty easy day, except for one thing. We've got to first review those 15 questions we asked. So we're going to simulate like I went out and talked to our stakeholders, the people that asked for the application, and said, what do you want? Here's these 15 questions I have. What are the answers? So, of course, I asked myself because I'm also the stakeholder in this demo. But let's go right into question number 1 and look at the answer. So the question is, how many players will a tournament handle? Is it variable? And the answer is the application should be able to handle a variable number of players in the tournament. Pretty straightforward. Basically what they're saying is we don't know how many players will be in the tournament. Could be 2, could be 4, could be 14, 16, or whatever. Question number 2. If a tournament has less than the full complement of players, how do we handle it? So the idea here is a 14-person tournament. Well, 14 does not divide evenly. The ideal would be 16 in that case. So how do we do that? Well, a tournament with less than the perfect number should add buys in. Basically, certain people are selected at random. That's a key thing there, at random, to get to skip the first round and act as if they've won. So we'll need to figure out how to do random assignment of buys. Question number 3. Should the ordering of who plays each other be random or ordered by the input order? And the ordering of a tournament should be random. So we're not going to take in players and say if you came in first, you get the first slot. If you came in second, you get the second slot. That's not how we're going to do it. We're going to randomize once all the players are in the list. Question number 4, should we schedule the games or they play whenever? And the games should be played in whatever order and whenever the player wants to play them. So that answers that question for us. It also is going to answer one of the follow-up questions, and that is question number 5. If the games are scheduled, how does the system know when to schedule the games for? Well, we're not going to schedule it. Therefore, we don't care. Question number 6, but if the games are played whenever, can a game from the second round be played before the first round is complete? Nope. Each round should be fully completed before the next round is displayed. If there are 4 games in the first round, if the first 2 games are played and done, that will determine the next round's one of their games. But those 2 teams can't play each other until after the other 2 games are played in the current round. Question number 7. Does the system need to store a score of some kind or just who won? And this is a little more variable from our stakeholders. They're saying storing a simple score would be nice, just a number for each player. That way the tracker can be flexible enough to handle a checkers tournament, where the winner would have a 1, as in they won, and a loser would have a 0, meaning they lost. Or a basketball tournament where the score might be 110 to 95. So question number 8, and this is a big one, what type of front end should the system have? Is it a Windows form, web page, a phone app? And the answer came back as it should be a desktop system, but here's a keyword, for now. But down the road, our stakeholders might want to turn it into an app or a website. Now, what the answer to this question really means is we have a short-term solution, which is a Windows Forms application, but we have to keep in mind the long-term possible goal of moving this to a different user interface platform. So we should be designing our application with that long-term goal in mind while still building for today. So we'll probably push a lot of our code into a DLL or some type of storage where we can disconnect the user interface easily and put a new one on. All right, let's keep going, and we're going to kind of wrap up at the end with all this information in our head. Now we can start looking at how to put it all together. So keep these key details in mind. You might even want to take notes. Question number 9. Where will the data be stored? Well, ideally, the data should be stored in Microsoft SQL database. But please put an option to store it in a text file instead. So what the stakeholder is saying here is, I would love to say we're going to have a SQL server, but there might be instances where we don't have that luxury, and so I want a fallback plan, something that's simple that we know we're going to have, which would be a text file. So we'll have to write our data access logic in such a way that it either stores to a database or to a text file. Or maybe it stores to both and we have a backup system. We'll see. Question number 10. Will this system handle entry fees, prizes, or other payouts? Now, before I go into the answer, let me talk real world, because this application, this design, this whole process, I'm trying to get as close to real world as possible. And the real world answer will probably be that first sentence, yes. Now, as a developer, you should look at that and say, man, is that not helpful? And that's true, but sometimes you ask questions and the users just don't understand how to communicate back to you what you really need. So in this case, they see the will this system do X, and their thought is it's a yes or no question. In this case, yes. But what we're really asking is, will this system handle it, and how will it do it, or what will it do? What will it handle? Maybe a better way of saying this question would be, if this system handles entry fees, prizes, or other payouts, how will it handle it? What will it? What part of those will it handle? Some way to kind of draw out of the user more of an answer. Now, in this case, I've simulated the idea of I went back as the developer, went back to the stakeholder and said, okay, you say yes, what does that look like? So that would be the rest of this the answer. So that answer is the tournament should have the option of charging an entry fee. Prizes should also be an option. And that's where the administrator gets to choose how much money is awarded to a variable number of places, meaning it could be first place only, it could be first and second place, first, second, third place, and so on and so forth. The total cash amount should not exceed the income of the tournament. So if the tournament takes in $100, you can't award $1,000. And then there's also the thought of having a percentage-based system. And that's a nicety. So that would look like something like where you award the first place player 50% of the overall take. So if the tournament brings in $100, first place gets $50. But if the tournament takes in $50, the first place gets $25. That way, it's dependent on how the tournament does. Because again, remember, these tournaments, in theory, could be less than full. So in a 16-player tournament, we may only have 10 players, which means that we have 6 people not paying those 6 bye weeks or bye players. In that case, if you were basing your cash prizes on a $160 income, $10 per person, you'd only be bringing in $100. That'd be a problem. Now notice that it doesn't say we have to divide up everything to the winners. One use case for this could be where we do some kind of fundraising. Say we're going to, kind of like a 50-50 drawing or something like that, where we're going to have this tournament. We're anticipating bringing in $200. The top prize is going to get $50. Second place is going to get $25. And the third place is also going to get $25. And then, so that's half the money. And the other half would go towards Toys for Tots or whatever. So we could do that in this existing system, or we could divide everything up, or the tournament owner, the guy that's running the tournament, could just be taking his cut. So he says, I'll give out half of the overall income of the tournament. I'll pocket the other half as my fee for running the tournament. Who knows? It's important to think through those ideas, but we don't have to go so far down the rabbit hole that our whole application changes. We should just think through, would this fit these different scenarios that are possible or probable? And if we're not sure and something will change our application, we should talk to our stakeholders. All right, question number 11. What type of reporting is needed? Well, the answer is a simple report specifying the outcome of the games per round, as well as a report that specifies who won and how much they won. I'm assuming that the how much they won and who won would be at the end of the overall tournament. These reports can be just displayed on a form, or they can be emailed to tournament competitors and the administrator. So the idea is, we don't have a full robust reporting system with PDFs and layouts and all the rest of the stuff. Instead, what we have is either we just display on a form and say, here's the daily status, or we could be emailing the competitors and the administrator these updates. The round report as well as the end report of who won and how much. All right, question 12. Who can fill in the results of a game? The answer is great for us. It makes it simple. Anyone using the application should be able to fill in the game scores. That means we don't have to have this varying level of access or have this whole way of creating users to use our system and having passwords and all the rest. We just have to say, if you're using the application, you have rights to. And of course, the next question is, are there varying levels of access? And the answer would be no, because we're allowing everyone to do everything. But here's the kicker. We could say that competitors, or the administrator could say, competitors are not allowed into the application. And instead, they do everything via email. Now remember, this is a desktop application. This could reside on the administrator's desktop and not anybody else's. Which means that if they don't have access to the desktop of the administrator, they don't have access to the tournament. Which is actually kind of a two-level system. One level just gets emails. The other level is the one that has full control. So in theory, it could be, we wouldn't call it a two-level system just because we're not doing any kind of varying level of access inside the application. All right, question number 14. Should this system contact users about upcoming games? And the answer is yes. The system should email users And that's about the third or fourth time that email has come up. We're going to have to make sure that we know how to send or at least send emails from this system. So if I were taking notes, that'd be a big one that I write down, star, underline, and put a big arrow to. Make sure you know how to do email. So the system should email users that are due to play in a round as well as who is scheduled to play. So every player who's actually playing the current round will get an email saying, you're playing game number 3. It's Tim versus Bob. And that's probably about it. Maybe some details that the administrator sets up about options or when and where, those kind of things. But this is going to be an email that goes out automatically and not manually. So we can't have we can't have specific answers to where and when. But instead we have to rely on generic options or generic text to tell them that. Finally, question 15. Is each player on their own, or can teams use this tournament tracker? And the answer is the tournament tracker should be able to handle the addition of other members. All members should be treated as equal in that they can all get tournament emails. Teams should also be able to name their team. So the idea here is we're not going to pick a team captain. We're not going to say that all information goes through one person. If you're on a 5-person team, all 5 people get the same email saying, here's your game for this week or this round. Also, we're going to call that team something. You really don't want to refer to a team as Tim, Bob, Sue, and Mary's team. You want to refer to it as Team Snicker Bars, whatever. That's actually probably more information than a stakeholder normally would give you, unless they're really in tune with how to give information to developers. But I simulated here the idea of maybe I went back and forth a couple times until I finally got this full answer. Again, the real world is kind of messy, and communication is a very difficult thing to do well. The key here is to learn to ask better and better questions so that users understand what you need, and also to go back and get more information and kind of really dig deep on your general question or your first question in order to get the information you really need. So those are the answers to the 15 questions that we had. So now we have the initial requirements, and we have the answers to our 15 questions, which really give us more requirements. And so now we can move on to the big picture design. And the big picture design is where we look back at a high level at our application and say, okay, what should this in general look like? To use an example, if we were to design a picture, going to draw out a picture of an ocean with a sunset over it, the big picture idea for that would be we're going to need some tan for the sand. We're going to need some blues and some greens for the ocean, the sky. We're going to need some reds for the sun and probably have some birds in there and maybe some washed up flotsam on the shore. That's a big picture look at that painting. There's a whole lot more detail that would go into it in the future. But for right now, that gives you a good rough outline of this is what we're going to kind of do. In the same way with our application, we're going to develop that big picture view that doesn't get really specific on anything, but it gives us those initial guardrails or boundaries for how we're going to design this application. The first broad brushstroke of our application is the structure. In our case, the structure is going to be a Windows Forms application and a class library. And I point that out whenever I build an application. I try very hard to put all my code, or at least my models, into a class library. But I want to point that out very clearly here because we have to think back and say, oh wait, the Windows Forms application should not be our complete application because we want to take that off at some point and put something different on top. If we have all of our code behind the forms, that's not going to work. Now, it's not great application design anyway, but I want to specify here just to make sure that we have that brushstroke in place. Okay, the next one is data. In that case, we're going to look at SQL and or a text file for storing information. What that data looks like or how it's being designed, or if we use one text file or 20, all those questions we're not really going to answer here. That'll be when we dive deeper later. But for now, we just know we need SQL and text file storage. Next is users. And what this represents is who's going to use our application and when. In our case, it's very, very simple. It's awesome. One at a time on one application. We're not looking to have 50 users using different applications that all point back to the same SQL database or text file. We don't have 18 different levels of security and all this authentication system going on. We just have one user at one time on one application. So that's the broad overview of our application. It seems very, very simplistic, but it's actually really important that you identify this because it puts some boundaries around you. Now, those boundaries are pretty broad. You can do a lot inside these. But what it does do is it keeps you from saying, well, maybe I should make this user interface a web application. Nope, it's a Windows Forms application. Well, maybe I should just go ahead and design an app now. Nope, Windows Form application. Well, maybe I should just store the information in memory. Nope, SQL and text file. See, all those questions that you might think down the road or might start wandering down that path, you can say, nope, these are my boundaries. And we'll make these boundaries even tighter as we go. But for right now, it's a great place for us to start before we start laying out our more detailed plan. Now, the other thing I like to do at this point is identify the big concepts in this application that I might not know everything about. So let's look at these key concepts for our application. Email. How do we email from C#? I'm going to have to figure that out at some point. So I have to keep that back in my mind. Maybe I should learn about that before I go on, or maybe I should do some research and do a trial app to make sure I understand how to do that and what the best way of doing that is. In our case, we don't have to do this kind of stuff because we're going to walk through it as we go, and I do know how to do these concepts. But again, I just want to simulate the idea of real world. In the real world, this is exactly what I do. I identify my key concepts, and I say, I need to build a small demo application to make sure I understand this, not to have the code then to plop in later, but to have the idea of how it works so that my design takes those kind of things into account. All right, so email is one. SQL. It's pretty important we know how to access our data. Next is one you might have missed, and that's custom events. And the reason I said that we need to understand custom events is because I started thinking about the application. I'm still in big picture mode here, but I'm thinking when one game is complete and it's the last game in the round, how are we going to know to check to make sure there's no more games? And how are we going to know if there are no more games to move to the next round? And how are we going to know to trigger those emails that go out saying, here is the overview of round one, here's what happened? And that sounded an awful lot like custom events. And so I said, you know what? I think it's custom events. I'm not going to lock into that right now, but I probably should at least learn a little bit about them so that I know how to use them if I need to. The bonus here is if you learn a little bit about them and kind of brush up on them, even if you knew something about them before, but you're just kind of rusty, if you know more about them, before you then go into further planning steps, you'll know if they're a good fit, and you'll know kind of how they're going to fit in there in your design. And the more information you know up front, the better your application will be in the long run. The next key concept is error handling. We're going to need to take in information from the user. We really shouldn't trust the users to give us the right information all the time. So we need to have some type of error handling in place to scrub that data, to prompt them to give us better data, and to make sure that we don't have any problems as we go. So error handling is important. Interfaces is another key concept. And this is one that if you're like, what are interfaces? Don't worry, we'll get there. But I know from experience of building this type of application that it's going to be kind of important to know how to use interfaces, because we're going to use those to pass information back and forth from form to form. Also, random ordering. We've mentioned 4 or 5 times in the answers to our questions the idea of random. We have it's random who gets what in what order. It's random who gets a buy for the first week if there is one. And so this idea of random or randomizing information is going to be important. And we'll have to look at randomizing in a couple different ways. Maybe we have to figure out random numbers, or maybe it's just how you shuffle a list in a random way. And really shuffling a list is random numbers kind of stepped up a notch. So we'll need to keep that idea in our minds. And this last concept is one that really wasn't mentioned in our requirements anywhere, but it's an idea that I have for a possible add-in or a possible bonus upgrade for this software, and that's the idea of texting. We alert people via email about upcoming games and when games are done and when rounds are done and when the whole tournament is done. Maybe some users are going to want to have their notifications texted to them as well. It's not something that's going to change our application as far as structurally. Really all it is we're going to add this on top. So when we capture their first name and last name and email address in order to email them, we'll also capture their phone number. And then maybe we'll put something in place where they can have the option of getting a text as well, or we'll have some other mechanism in place to determine should we send a text. But that's really a bonus or an extra. It's not something that's really a part of our requirements. And it's okay to have these bonus ideas as long as they don't affect the overall application. If this were to change how we do things, for example, if I had to capture now a team captain instead of just capturing team members, that would be a problem because that was something specified in the requirements. So I'd need to go back to the stakeholders and say, do you want this, and this is what it will take, or this is what it will do to one of your other requirements. But if it's something that's really just an add-on or extra, that might be something you could plan to do or even do if you're pretty confident the customer or the stakeholder would want it. One area that can be important or even really helpful to you is if you are in business, especially a small business, where you're building something for someone that it's not quite as defined as maybe a big company might define an application. It's really just this loose structure like this one was. Maybe it's nice to give them a little something extra so that they see that you're not only hitting your goal for the application, which is the goal would be to meet all the requirements, but that you're going above and beyond. But the key here is to know when to do this and when not to do this. It's definitely not a good idea to do something like this if you're not going to meet your deadline. In fact, I would say do everything else first, and if you have time, make it better. And this could be one way to make it better. So that's really it. We've covered all of our questions and the answers we got back from our stakeholders. And out of that, we built one big set of requirements. And from that, we were able to develop this big picture design. We were also able to develop these key concepts that we might need to go out and research to understand better. Now, normally, if I were doing this in the workplace environment and I was unsure of something in my key concepts list, this is where I'd go out and start researching that. But again, we're simulating as though we know all of these because I'm going to teach you all of these. So therefore, we can kind of skip that step. Welcome to lesson number 3 in the C# from start to finish course. We're looking at data design. Now, we've already set up the boundaries for our application, the requirements that drive how the application gets built. And we've kind of built a little bit of a structure, but now we're going to take those requirements and build an actual data structure. Now, at this point, some people may say, I've seen it done differently in other lessons. I've seen some people design the front end first and then develop the data later. And that's true. Some people like to design how the application looks first, and then from that, it helps them decide what to do with data. I've done that before, but I've found the best success for me comes when I design the data first. And here's why. Your application is nothing without data. In fact, your application is just a vehicle to display, manipulate, change, and save data. Now think about that for a minute, because at first it sounds wrong. So start thinking through some examples. Let's start with something simple. Let's look at a text editor. Think of maybe Microsoft Word even. What's its job? Well, it all revolves around the text on the page. Whether it is which items are bolded, which items are underlined, the spacing, and all the rest, all of that is data, and it all revolves around that data that you give it. And maybe right now you're saying, okay, sure, line up business applications, the basic applications, would use data a lot, and they're kind of centered around data. But certain applications aren't. For example, a game. A game is not based around data. Well, really, yes, it is. Let's take, for example, chess. Chess is all data. You've got pieces in certain locations. So you have what the piece is, what it can do, and where it's located. Then you have the game board and where each piece is in relation to each other on that game board. And then you have the moves and where the pieces go. That's all data. And sure, that's chess, but if we look at a more complex or a larger example, say a first-person shooter game, how can that possibly be data? Well, you have to know where your character is and where every other character is, the system does, in order to know when you shoot a bullet, first of all, where it's going to go, that's data. How fast it's going to get there, that's data. And when it gets there, who it's going to hit, if anybody. If it hits somebody, how much damage does it do, that's data. You start seeing all the data that goes on behind the scenes sometimes, but still is fundamental to the application. It's all about that data. Again, looking at that first-person shooter game, what's the end result you want to see? A victory. How do you determine victory? Based upon the data that says, all my foes have been conquered. So data is very important. And that's why I start with my data. I will often find that it's easier to develop my front-end user interface once I have my data, because I see what needs to be done, and then it's just a matter of how I accomplish that instead of just drawing from a blank slate with no information. All right, so that's enough theory. Let's get into actually mapping out our data. Now, typically, I draw this out on a legal pad or my whiteboard, and both are great ways to visualize what needs to happen, and at the same time, they're quick to change. Now, that's kind of hard for me to show you on video, So instead, we're going to kind of fast forward to when I'm done my design, but I'll walk you through it step by step. So when I do this development, there's a lot of scratch this out, move this around, erase this, draw a line through this, move this over here, because developing on paper is so easy to make changes. I would encourage you, and I started this course by saying, don't open Visual Studio yet. Do this development of the plan in Notepad, in your scratch pad, in a legal pad, on your whiteboard. Don't do it inside of code or inside of Visual Studio. And that still holds true here. I'm just going to show you the cleaned up end result of all that planning. And I'll walk you through some of the questions that I had, the thoughts that I had along the way. So this is really where I start, the blank page. And really, this can be intimidating at first because you don't know, where do I start? What's the best place to start? And the answer is really just put something down. And so I said, well, let's start with team. I know I need to have some kind of team that has people in it and has a team name and all the rest. So I started with team. And I said, on that team, we're going to have members. Now in parens, I put, this is the type that I think we're going to need to have. So I said, probably a list of type person. I don't have a person list yet. And maybe at that point, I pause and say, create a person list. But my focus is on, let's just get the team built first. Now, the other thing here is I don't typically put types in until after I've come back through. But in this case, I'm showing you the end product. And so I put the types in there. But really what you want to do is you want to get all the information about a team down first before you do anything else. Don't worry about types for now, but do a second pass. After you got all the data in place, do a second pass and assign types to each one, just so you make sure you understand how this whole thing's going to work. Again, since I didn't have a type person yet, I'd make a note of that, but not actually develop the person class or the person group of information yet, because I'm focusing on team. If I leave team to build person, I might forget where I was in team and miss a key component. So always focus on one thing at a time. Everything else gets written down for later. So I have members. So that would be the number of people on a team, which could be one person. It's a one-person team, say for our ping pong tournament. Or it could be 5 people, say for a basketball team. Or it could be 20 people, maybe for some kind of office game. It doesn't really matter. What really matters is that we have that list that can have really 0 or more. But in our case, we kind of want to force it to have at least one person on the team. The team name. We know that each team has to have a name in order to call it something better than Tim, Bob, Mary, Sue. Oh, that might be a great team name. Who knows? And that'd be a string. So that's really all the team class is. So let's move on to person. Since we created this list of person, let's go ahead and now create that person object so we get that out of our mind too. We have a first name, which is a string. That's pretty straightforward. A last name, also a string. We could have asked for just name and had first and last name together, but I find that breaking that apart into 2 different properties or 2 different data points is, first of all, best practice in the industry, meaning the industry does this by default or does this most of the time, but also it makes it a whole lot easier for us to do things like have an email where it says, Dear Tim. It seems more personal that way instead of Dear Tim Corey. So breaking it apart into 2 different objects and having the user break that apart is very important. You could say, well, I know how to break a string apart based on the space. Therefore, Tim Corey could be in that variable. I could break it apart and say the first part is the first name, the second part is the last name, which only works when a person only has one space in their full name. What if, for example, they said they had a last name that has space in it? Van space Wilder is the last name, Van Wilder. Well, that would come out as split apart. That's a problem. Wilder is not the last name. It's Van Wilder. First name is Joey. The same thing is true for first name. Maybe the first name is Mary Sue. Well, if the first name truly is Mary Sue, or they put Mary Sue as their first name, Mary Sue Smith, if we broke that apart, we'd say the first name is Mary, not Mary Sue. So breaking things apart can get ugly really quickly. Instead of breaking things apart later, you can put them together later. And that also allows you to do interesting things like last name, first name, or first initial, last name. Okay, let's look at the next property, email address. So we need to capture the person's email address, and that's also a string, and cell phone number. And that too is a string, and that trips some people up here. The idea that right in the name, cell phone number, and yet we're not saving it as some type of number, whether it's an int or a double or anything like that. We're storing it as a string. And the reason why is because we don't treat a cell phone number as if it were a number itself. So for example, the number, we can add to that, we can subtract from it, we can divide it, we can multiply it. But doing that to a cell phone number doesn't make sense. We wouldn't add 2 to a cell phone number for any reason. The cell phone number is what it is and it never changes. Also, we might want to store some type of formatting. For example, around the area code in the United States, we put parentheses, then we put a space, and then after the first 3 numbers of the actual phone number, we put a dash, and then the last 4. Well, you can't really do that and store it that way. And you might say, well, yeah, but I'll store it as just numbers. Well, that's great, but it still doesn't get past the idea of this isn't really a number to be manipulated. So we're going to store it as a string. Now you may have caught me saying a couple times properties. And I want to stop for a minute and point that out. Really what we're doing here is we're creating our classes. So a team is going to be a class, person will be a class, and inside those classes will be these properties. Now it's not a direct one-to-one matchup right now because, for example, cell phone number. I might change it to cell phone or phone number or something like that. But it's a pretty close matchup. Now there may be other classes we create, but these are really our foundational classes on which the application gets built. These 2 plus the others we'll talk about in a minute. And I don't want you to get too caught up in the idea of code, but I do want you to be thinking about the fact that really these do map up pretty directly to classes, which is why I call these items properties. So just keep that in the back of your mind. When it comes to actually building our class library, having our data mapped out like this makes creating our foundation of our class library so very easy. Okay, back to our data. Our third class, or our third set of data, we'll call tournament. And this is all the data that surrounds the actual tournament, which is what this entire application is based upon. This is a tournament tracker. So this is going to be the central data hub, or a central bit that everything revolves around. So the first thing we need is a tournament name. Now that's not specified anywhere in the requirements, but we do mention the idea that there might be more than one tournament at a time. And so if there's more than one tournament, how do you know which tournament is which? You could look at who's playing in them and what round they're in and all the other details, but really that's so imprecise. So instead, we're going to specify that every tournament be given a name. That way you could say ping pong tournament, basketball tournament, and then you know exactly which tournament you're talking about. Next, we'll have an entry fee. Remember we talked about the idea that we could accept fees, or we could say that every person or every team needs to turn in a fee? Well, this entry fee is going to allow the administrator, the person that sets up a tournament, to say there is an entry fee to this tournament and it's $10 or whatever it is. And then every time we add a team to the tournament, we're going to charge that team the entry fee. So that would be of type decimal. And that's something else to point out. We'll get into more of the C# after we're actually inside Visual Studio. But for now, I just want to point out that because this is money, this entry fee, we should store it in type decimal, not double. On the surface, these two data types look very, very similar, decimal and double. They both store numbers that have a decimal point in them. The difference is precision. Decimal is very, very precise, but it also takes up a lot more memory. And so we typically only use this when we're talking about money. Double is a little less precise, but if you look at the actual precision, we're still precise to about, I believe it's 14 decimal places or 14 places after the decimal. That's good enough for me. But in the case of money, we really should have decimal. Okay, I mentioned that the entry fee is going to be charged, if there is one, to every team that enters the tournament, which means we have to have a list of teams in the tournament, or I called it entered teams, teams that have entered the tournament. And that would be a list of type team. The great thing here is when we're developing this tournament, we're not thinking about, oh, I have to enter the first name and last name and email address and phone number of these people who were on teams and all the rest. We're just concentrated on what the tournament needs. Even if we hadn't yet created that team or that list of person called team members or anything else, we could say, I just need a list of teams. And then from there, we could say, okay, in a team, this is what I need. And then in a person, this is what I need. And so really when we're developing this data, we can't look too broadly. We have to focus on just what makes sense for this particular object or this particular chunk of a data. What goes together? In this case, we're talking about tournament. So the name of the tournament, the entry fee, the entered teams, and then also the prizes. The list of prizes contains just that, a list of prize. What's a prize? Well, we talked about the idea of having, for first place you get half the money, or first place you get $50, whatever we want to do is in setup. So we need to have a list of those. And this list, it truly is a 0 or more list. Maybe we don't have any prizes. Maybe we have 1, maybe we have 15. The next property for our tournament is going to be rounds. And this one's a bit tricky. And you got to think through how this is going to work. Now, we haven't built the matchup object yet, but a matchup would be one team versus another team. So we're going to have a look from the middle out. So we have a matchup, that's one team versus another. We're going to have a list of those matchups per round. So we'll have a list of matchups that's round 1, another list of matchups that's round 2, another for round 3, 4, and so on. So one list represents one round. Therefore, we have a list of matchup. You get that? You might have to draw it out on paper to think it through. We have matchups, but then we have a set of matchups that represents one round. And this rounds property holds all the rounds. So it has multiple lists, one for each round. Thus, the list of a list of matchup. And that's really what the tournament object contains. And at this point, there's a couple things I want to point out. First of all, we don't have the prize object or the matchup object yet. That's okay. We've written those down as we need these. We'll get back to them. We're concentrating on tournament. The other thing I want to point out here is there's going to be data besides what you have here. You're going to miss stuff. You're going to not think things through all the way necessarily. There may be things that you need for certain things. For example, in SQL, which is where you want to store our data, one of the places, typically what you do is you have a unique identifier for every row in a table. Well, probably team will be a table, and person will be a table, and tournament will be a table. And so each of these will probably have a unique identifier. Now, there are certain things that we call natural keys we could use for identifiers. For example, in tournament name kind of specifies, this is this tournament and not one of 3 tournaments called this. So for example, you wouldn't have 3 different tournaments all called basketball tournament because he couldn't identify which one was which. Therefore, you'd say men's basketball tournament, women's basketball tournament, mixed basketball tournament. There's 3 different ones. And so the tournament name would be unique across all the tournaments. That could be a natural key. I'm not a big fan of natural keys. I like to create my own. And so it'd be something I'd call ID, and it'd be just a counter, 1, 2, 3, 4. It makes it a little easier for indexing, and it's just easier to work with that. And so really, we're missing that ID property, probably on all 3 of these. And that's okay. If you notice that, you can go back and put that on all of the places where you need it. But you're going to miss something. And that's what I want to get across to you is the idea of it's okay. You may miss stuff. You don't have to get this 100% right. Don't stress out about it. Instead, do your best, think it through. Don't rush through it, for sure. but make sure that you at least get everything that you know and a little more in here. Do some research. Look at what other people do or what information other people capture in these type of situations. For example, a simple example, the person class. Right now we're capturing first name, last name, email address, and cell phone number. Go find out what other people do when they're capturing a person. And you may say, I have no clue where to look. Well, think about Amazon. When you sign up for an account at Amazon, Amazon asks you for certain information. What is that information? Not the billing information, the personal information. For example, they're going to ask things like where you live. They might ask for 2 different phone numbers, a home phone and a cell phone. Or they might ask you to tell them what type of phone number you're giving them. They might ask for a middle name or middle initial. Another place you could go look would be a contact on your phone. Go into contacts and say add new contact and look at all the information that you can add about a contact, because a contact is really just a person. And you don't have to do everything that everybody else does. In fact, please don't. But it's a really good idea to look through some examples to say, no, I don't need that. No, I don't need that. Oh, I didn't think about this one. Maybe I do need that one. And that'll just help you better visualize what data you need up front. But once you've done that, again, don't stress out about, I have to look at 10 more examples to make sure I don't miss anything. That's not what this process is about. We're going to make mistakes, and it's okay. In fact, I know in my planning, I've made mistakes. In fact, when we get to lesson 5, I'll point out a couple of my mistakes that I've made in this process so far. And you know what? It's okay, because we can work through it. Now, I caught that still in the planning stage, which is good because it's easier to change things in planning than it is once we start developing. But you know what? Even in development, I'll capture more errors or more things that I've missed. And we'll figure out how to handle it at that point. Is it as convenient as handling it now? No. But you know what? You can't ever get things perfect up front. If you try to do that, you'll spend way too much time planning and you'll never get your application out the door. And a well-planned application that's still on your legal pad is useless. What you need is something out the door. So there is that balance of we should definitely plan before we start building. But we don't want to get so bogged down in planning that we don't build. So that's just the tension we're going to work through. But the big keynote here that I want to point out again and again is don't worry. Don't overthink it. Okay, so let's move on. We know we have prize and matchup are 2 more objects we need to create in order to support the tournament object. Let's start with the prize object. Inside the prize object, we have a place number, and that's an int or a number. So what the place number is we're talking about first place, second place, third place. And we represent that with just a number. 1 represents first place, 2, second place, 3, third place. So if I said the place number is 10, what place is that? Well, it's the 10th place. So it's pretty straightforward. There's not any kind of matchup you have to do. We understand number 1 is first place. Next, we have place name. So this is where we're going to specify what that place is called. And you might think, wait a minute, we just said what those places are, first place, second place, third place. But maybe we want to call it champion is first place. Second place we call first runner up. You see how that terminology might be a little bit different? So we'll put that in this string field. The administrator, when they're setting up a tournament, they can specify anything they want for that place name. And then we'll use that when we're talking about the prizes that were won. So Tim won the championship and got $50. Or Tim was the first runner up and earned $25. So that's that place name. It's just a name that we are given to describe that place. And it could be first or second. So now we have the amount. Again, this is money, so it's a decimal. And that prize amount is how much in dollars we're going to assign to this place. And if you're remembering your requirements for this application, we said it's either a flat amount or it's a percentage. And so we also created the prize percentage property, and that's a type double. So for example, 0.5 would be 50%. So if you remember back to requirements, we said it's either a prize amount, a fixed amount, or it's a percentage. So how do we represent that in this prize object? Well, some of that comes down to we'll probably have some kind of read-only property, but also if prize amount is 0 and prize percentage is 0.5, we know it's 50%. If the prize amount is $20, the prize percentage is 0, we know that the prize is $20. And so we'll use that idea of one is 0, therefore the other one is the one that we use. And if both are 0, we have no prize, which doesn't really make sense that we then create that, but maybe we do. But that would be the prize object. A place, a name, an amount, and a percentage. Now on to the matchup object. And in the matchup object, we have entries, which is a list of matchup entry. What's a matchup entry? We'll get to that. But the idea is that a matchup entry would be one person. And so we'll have more than one person in a matchup. Obviously, we'll have at least two. And in fact, this system is designed for just two. But we'll still have that called a list. Then we have a winner. We're going to specify which team is the winner. We're going to put that in its own property. That way we can pull out information about the winner, like their email address to email them, or that kind of thing. So it makes it just a little bit easier if we have that winner property. And we also have a round number. Is this matchup for round 1, for round 2, for round 18? What is it? And that's it. So now we have this matchup entry. And this is where we describe what we have in that list of matchup entry, those entries, what they really mean. First, we have a team competing. So it's one team. So that represents this entry in the matchup is one team. Their score, if they have any, it'd start at 0. But then once we mark them as their score, then we know. And then the parent matchup. So what I did here, originally I had team 1 and team 2 up in the matchup object. And I said we only ever have two teams. But then I had team 1 score, team 2 score. And that didn't fit right with me. The idea that we had properties that were mirrored for two different teams for their information. I didn't really like that. And so what I decided was I'm going to create a list, even though there'll only be two. I'll create a list and then I'll create an object for each entry so I can have multiple data points about that entry in one object. And one of the ways this helps me is I can reorder that list based upon things like score. So I can say, give me the top one matchup entry, order by score. And if the score goes the opposite direction, meaning it's like golf where the low score wins, I can say take the entries list, which is that list of matchup entry, order it descending by score, which would give me a low score first, and then it's giving me the first person. And that gives me the winner, which I can put in the winner object, and it allows me to then say other things as well, order by something else. The other thing it allows me to do, though, is it keeps the team competing, their score, and where they came from all together. Now that where they came from is kind of important. That's what I call the parent matchup. So this is, in round 2, we know that this team came from this other matchup in round 1. So round 1 was played, team 1 played team 2. Team 1 lost. Therefore, team 2 goes on to round 2. So they have, team 2 has their matchup entry. They'll have a score of 0 to start, but they'll have a parent matchup of their win from round 1. That way we can link a winner all the way back through the different rounds. So it's going to be a bit confusing, I know, but this is my idea of how to deal with that whole matchup and which teams and all the rest, how to deal with that in a way that makes sense, or at least it makes sense to me. And we'll see as we put it down in actual code how it works out in the application. You know what? Right here we have all of our data we need for our application, or at least the broad strokes of all of our data we need for application. These 6 classes are what the application is going to revolve around. And we're done. Welcome to Lesson 4 in C# from start to finish. I am Tim Corey, and today we're going to look at building our user interface in the design phase for our tournament tracker. And this is the fun step because we actually get to see kind of a rough idea of what our application is going to look like, which really helps cement some ideas in our minds, and it also helps hone our overall idea for how the application should work. Now, normally in this process, this is where I get out my whiteboard or my legal pad and I start drawing. And I am not an artist by any stretch of the imagination, but I still like to draw it out because that way I can scrap it, erase it, start over, and it gives me an idea of what the thing should look like, what the form should basically be. It doesn't have to be pretty. It doesn't have to be even proportional. It doesn't have to have all of the extras that you're going to want to add to make this thing really pop. It just has to have the basic idea of these are the forms I need, or these are the pages I need, and that's it. So the question that comes up is, where do I start? And that's the same question we have when we started the data design. Where do I start with this thing? And really the answer is, it doesn't matter. Just start somewhere. If you aren't sure of a certain part of the application, start with what you are sure of. Get that stuff out of the way first, and then come back to what you're not sure of. More often than not, you'll find that you've got a better idea now of how that piece should work. And you've also got that momentum of, I've done this 4 or 5, 6, 7 times. I'm on a roll. I can do this. So with that in mind, I'm going to start with our tournament viewer form. Now, before I go to that form, I want to talk a little bit about how I've adjusted for working on video. And so one of the things I'm not going to do is just show a whiteboard session. I'm actually going to show you a somewhat completed form. Now, it's not going to be pretty. It's not going to have, again, all the visuals, but it gives us an idea of where to go. Now, again, before I show you this, I want to emphasize I don't encourage you to do this in Windows Form Builder. Don't go into Visual Studio and create a new form and design it and call that your design process. That's not a real design. You don't want to start there, and the reason why is because one of 2 things will happen. Either one, you'll spend way too much time tweaking the layout and looking for different controls and trying things out and naming things and all this other stuff that's really not necessary in this part of the process. Or you'll create this form, and in the end you'll say, that's great, I'm going to use that for my actual application. And while it sounds like you just saved some time, what you really did is you shortcutted the design process, and you haven't looked at other ideas or alternatives, and you've probably left yourself some problems in the form that you kind of worked around because you don't want to redo it. Whereas if it's on a paper, you can go ahead and scratch it out and try again. You can try weird and silly things and say, yep, that's not going to work. Or you'll have the epiphany when you try something silly and go, wait, that's not silly, it's awesome. So definitely put it on paper. But for our purposes, since I am showing on video, I'm actually going to show you a completed form, and we're going to walk through my thought process and some of the things that I changed and tweaked until I got it somewhat right. And again, this is about an 85 to 95% certainty. This is not 100% done, even in the rough layout. All right, that's enough preamble. Let's actually jump right into Tournament Viewer. All right, here's a Tournament Viewer form that I created. Now again, it's ugly right now. That's okay. Let's walk through my ideas for this form. First, we have the tournament and that name in the less than, greater than signs. And so what that's going to be is that's going to say the name of this particular tournament. So this form is going to display all the information about one tournament. So it's going to first say this is the women's basketball tournament, or whatever we've called our particular tournament. Again, at this part of the process, we don't care how the information got here. We don't care about what the back end's going to look like. We just want to look at user interface layouts. So pretend like the rest doesn't exist and you're just developing cool screens. So we have the tournament name. Next, we have this round drop down. And so here's my thought. I didn't know of a good way to lay out the tournament bracket and have this huge bracket on the screen. We can see all the games in a nice ordered layout. And really, even if I found a third-party control that did it, that's not going to teach you a whole lot because you're not going to use that bracket in your job or to create your own application unless you're also creating a tournament viewer. So instead, I thought, what if I showed a list box, that matchup list box, and in that list box, I had just the games in this particular round, in one round. And so that drop down for round allows me to choose which round I'm displaying. So in a 4-round tournament, it could be round 1, round 2, round 3, round 4. So that drop down would change based upon the number of rounds. The list box would change based upon which round is selected in the drop down. And then my final piece I thought of was, what if we only showed the games that have not yet been played? Let's think for a minute about a tournament that has 16 games in the first round. That's a lot of games. But imagine we have 16 games in this list box. Well, if we only have 2 left to play, you're weeding through 14 played games to find the 2 that aren't played. So instead, we could check that box that says unplayed only. I'll probably have it default to be checked. But if that box is true, then we'll only show the games that have not yet been played. So as you play games, that list will get shorter and shorter until there's none left in the list. I also had a thought that I would change the round drop down based upon the current active round. So for example, it would default to whatever round we're currently in. If we're in round 3 right now, it wouldn't start off this form with round 1, it would start in round 3. How that's going to work, I don't know yet. I just wrote it down on my paper as, this is a cool idea, remember this for later. Because now I'm not doing code, I'm doing user interface design. Now on the right, we have sample team 1 and a score and a box. They have versus and sample team 2, the score and the box. So this section right here, what I'm doing, or what I'm thinking I'm going to do, is I'll have the name of team 1 and the name of team 2. And then we'll be able to put in scores for them if they're not already scored. So if they're already scored, that box to the right of score will have an actual value. But if they've not been scored yet, it will have nothing. Once they've scored, we'll put the information in those 2 boxes and hit the score button to the right. The idea here is that would complete the matchup. Now, looking at it, I'm not sure that's my final design. I might want to change what that score button says and how those 2 boxes are laid out, just because I'm not sure it's totally clear with the score box versus the score button and how those 2 interact. And I want that to be very clear to the user that's using this form. So this form is basically done. There's not anything more that I think needs to be displayed on the form. It simply has all the games, and then you can score a particular game, and it will show you which ones are yet to be played. Pretty simple. We can probably add some more fun stuff, like maybe buttons that tell us who won the tournament or things like that. But right now, I think that this form is done in its design phase. So let's move on to our next form. Now again, it doesn't matter which order you do this in, but in my thought process, if I have a tournament viewer form, I'll probably need a tournament creator form. So here's my create tournament form. It starts off with asking for the tournament name, and then an entry fee box. That box will allow us to, if we want to, specify how much each team needs to pay to enter the tournament. And then it gets a little more complicated. So my thought is that we have a select team drop down. And what this will do is it will allow us to select an already existing team. Maybe one team enters more than one tournament, especially if that team is one person. So if we've already created a team, we don't need to recreate them. We just need to add them to our tournament. And when you hit the add team button, it's going to take whoever's in the drop down and add them to the list box on the right at the upper top where it says team/players. And that'll be who is in the tournament. Now, if we don't already have a team and we need to create one, that's that create new link. And while I don't get individuals too much at this point, that's why they're ugly gray forms, I did like the idea of having that create new be somewhat different than the other buttons, just so it's pretty obvious that we're creating a new team versus creating a new team on this tournament, as in using an existing team, but adding them to the tournament. So It was just confusing. I decided that link button needed to be a bit different. Okay, so we've got the drop down for teams. We've also got the create new button for the team. Both of those will add whatever team we either create or select to the list box on the right. And now we have prizes, because a tournament has a name, an entry fee, players, and prizes. And if you're confused as to what a tournament has, you can go back and look at your data model, because the data model for a tournament tells you all the things you're going to need to capture. So for prizes, I didn't expect we'd have prizes roll over from one tournament to the next. They just seemed too different to me, especially the variable number of players in the tournament. So instead, I said we'll create a new prize list every time from new prizes. So instead of the drop down, we just have the create prize button. And that will pop up a new form, just like the create new team will pop up a new form. So again, in your notes, you should note that we have two more forms to create now, the create new team and the create new prize. Once the prize is created, it'll get added to the prizes list box. That seems pretty straightforward. Now, next to the list boxes, and I'll change these icons probably. I'll probably go with some kind of red X or something like that. But the delete selected. Whenever you have a list box where you're adding something to it, you need to have some way to get them out to. For example, maybe you add a player or a team and you didn't want to. You want to take them back off. You've got to have a way to do that without closing the form and restarting. And that's really all I have for this form. I just have that create tournament button, which will take all the information and create a tournament object. The assumption is this will also get saved in a database or a text file in some way. But again, we don't care about code at this point. Now, if you're looking at your model, you may have noticed that I'm missing one piece of data, and that is the rounds. We have a list of matchup, and this form doesn't cover rounds in any way. And the reason why is because rounds are random. Who goes in what order for each matchup is random. The number of rounds is determined based upon the number of teams. So all of that gets set up in code, and it's not something that the end user does at all. Therefore, it's not displayed on this form. Okay, according to my notes, the next form I had to create was the add team or the create new team form. And so let's go ahead and create that. And this is my idea for the create team form. It has a team name, which if you notice, let's go back to the create tournament, the tournament name, it's laid out the same way. And that's an idea that is really important to think about, is the continuity between forms. The idea that the same thing works the same way on multiple forms, or the same layout works kind of the same way. That way, even if you do things a little differently, the fact that it's done a little differently throughout your entire application makes your form and your application more cohesive. So you have the team name, and that's just a straight text field. Then we have select team members. Now this again pulls from the database with a text file, and it says, I already have team members. Why don't you just go ahead and add one of these if that's who you want? So if the same office team plays all the time, so you have 10 people in the office, well, there's no reason to recreate who they are every single time. They're the same 10 people. Therefore, for the second tournament, we'll just select the team members from the list because we've already created them in the first tournament. So the select team member, we'll select who to add as a member of this team, or if they're not already in the team member list, we can add them right in line. Now it's important to note that this form now does two different things. It both creates teams and also creates members. And sometimes that's not the best way of doing things. Sometimes you want some separation there where you have a button that goes to a new form for add member. But for me, what I said was, this is such a little bit of data, just 4 fields, all text fields, and I have the space in the create team form. Let's go ahead and put that right in line with this form, because I know that at least for the first little bit, I'm going to be entering new members right away multiple times. And I don't want to go 3, 4, and 5 forms deep to create a tournament. Now don't forget, we're already in form number 2. Because form number 1 was create tournament. And on there, it had a create team button. So in this, that's this form right here. Now if we say add new member or create member is a new form that's 3 layers deep. And it just gets confusing and it gets cumbersome. And so the more I can streamline that by putting things together, the better I feel about it from a user acceptance and a user comfort level with my application. Now that might not be something you're comfortable with, and that's fine. You can definitely have just a button here and open a new form. But for me, I like the compact, quicker design process of this create team form. So that's what we're going to do. So whether you add a member from the list or create a member, either way, they get added to the tournament players list box. Once all the team members have been added, and once the team has been named, we go ahead and create the team. And that's it. And that's the create team form. So the next form, according to my notes, is that create prize form. And that's really simple. So remember we have back on our tournament form, we have that create prize button that's going to allow us to create one prize and add it to our list of prizes. So this represents one prize. So for example, place number 2, place name, second place, prize amount, $20, or prize percentage, 0.15 or 15%, in which we accept there is definitely up to us at build time. So it's pretty straightforward. It has 4 input boxes and that button to create the prize. There'll be a little more that goes on behind the scenes to say don't allow both prize amount and prize percentage. But besides that, we don't have a whole lot to work with here as far as difficulty. And so that brings us to our last form. And this form I really wrestled with. So I'm going to show you the form first, and then let's talk about it. This is my tournament dashboard form. Now, I'm not totally in love with this, but I have come to the conclusion this is probably the easiest way to make this whole thing work. You see, when you create a Windows Forms application, and again, we're getting a little bit into code, and that's okay, but when you create a Windows Forms application, it wants to create one form and leave it open the entire time. You can open new forms, and you can close those new forms. But if you close the main form, the application is done. And so I was wrestling this idea of how do I do multiple tournaments, and how do I have this system where a form stays open the whole time that's logical. At first I thought about having this switching system where it said, if you have no tournaments currently running, open the create tournament form. But if you have an existing tournament, go to that tournament instead. And that kind of works, except for the fact that maybe you want to have 2 tournaments running. How do you create the second tournament? And if you do create the second tournament, how does the system know which tournament to open up? And if you have no tournaments yet and it opens the create tournament form, when you're done creating the tournament, it's going to close that form, which closes the application. And that doesn't work. So I said, I need some sort of central form that kind of coordinates or quarterbacks everything. And that's this stupid little form. Here's what it does. It allows you to see what tournaments are currently open. You select one and you hit load tournament and it opens the tournament form, the tournament viewer. Or you can say create tournament, even if you currently have existing tournaments. When you create a tournament, it opens the create tournament form, which is pretty self-explanatory. But this form stays open all the time. That way, if you close out of the create tournament form, you still have this form and that dropdown should be updated. If you have a tournament viewer form open, it will be on top of this dashboard. You won't see the dashboard. The only time you'll see this dashboard is if you have nothing else open. So again, I'm not in love with it, but I think it works. And so we may have to tweak how it looks a little bit because it really is stupid simple. So maybe do some kind of design around it to make it a little more inviting, more splash pagey or something like that. But the key here is this is what we need on the form, and this is the form we need to use to open the application on. And that is the conclusion of our user interface design. That's really all there is. You just kind of sketch out some forms and say, what do I need on each form and what forms do I need? That's really it. Welcome to Lesson 5 in the C# from Start to Finish course. My name is Tim Corey, and today we're looking at logic planning. Now, so far in this course, we have scoped out our requirements, we have built the overall structure for our application as far as our design. We have designed our data backend and drawn out our front end. In this step, what we're going to do is look at some of the global ideas for how we're going to wire up our different forms. Now, there's a lot more to logic than just wiring up forms, but you'll find that wiring up the forms will do most of the major heavy lifting for your application. By the time you're done, you'll have just a few things left to do before your application is running. So today, we're going to talk through those global ideas, the big picture ideas. We won't get into the nitty-gritty of actually writing code, but instead we'll talk through what each different piece of the application should do. If I were doing this on paper, which I recommend you do, I'd write out some notes and thoughts on what each piece is going to do. I would redraw out each form and kind of put arrows there and say, okay, this button is going to do this and that button is going to do that. Now again, we're on screen, we're not showing a piece of paper. So what I will do instead is I'll bring up the form and then we'll talk through the logic behind each different piece. Like before, the order doesn't matter, but I'm actually going to readjust our order a little bit because I want to talk about one of the forms last because it's the most complicated, most complex. So let's go through the easier, more simple ones first, and then we'll get to the more complex one at the end. So let's start with the create tournament form. And this is the form we created in our previous step. We kind of drew it out. Again, remember that this is just a design of the application. It's not the actual form itself. It's just a concept of what the form will probably look like, or at least the structure of it. So the first thing we want to look at is this create new button. It's actually a button or a button link. But what this does is it's going to create a new team. Now remember, we have a new team form. So this button will open up that new form. But it's not done there. Once the new team gets created, we want to close out the new team form and come back to this form and have that data on the screen now in the team/players list box. And how we're going to do that is we'll probably create a method that the create team form can call saying, okay, here is the new team. Here's a new team object. And that's where, if you remember back to our big idea, the overview planning we did, we talked about key concepts. And one of the key concepts was interfaces. And this is probably a good place to have an interface because that way the form doesn't have to know, the create team form does not need to know about the tournament creator form. It just needs to know about the contract that the tournament creator form implements. And if you're not sure what that means, don't worry about it. We'll actually show it in code. We'll talk through it and talk through the different options we have. That's just where varying levels of experience will show you more or less that you need to do at a certain junction, or give you more of an idea of how you're going to do it. But if you don't have that experience, don't worry. You'll learn how to do it, and then next time you'll have that experience. Next, let's look at the add team button. Now this button is pretty straightforward in what it needs to do. It's going to look at which item is selected in that drop-down right above it, and it's going to take that item and put it in the list for the tournament players list box. It's also going to remove it from the drop-down list that it pulled it from. Once it's done both of those steps, we're going to need to refresh both the drop-down list and also the list box. Next, we have the create prize button. And this button works almost exactly like the create new over the selected team drop-down. The create prize button is going to open up a new form, wait until the prize gets created, and then take the value from that created prize and put it in the prizes list box. So really, the logic is basically the same. It's just which class you're creating. So there's not much more we need to say there. Next, we have these two delete selected buttons. What each of these is going to do, and they are so similar, I just highlighted them both. What each of these is going to do is when you click that button, it's going to delete whatever item in a list box to its left is selected. In the case of the teams list box, the additional step is it's going to put that team back in the select team drop-down box. And finally, we have the create tournament button. And this is actually the big one, because a lot of stuff goes on behind the scenes when this button is clicked. First of all, we're going to need to validate all this information. So for example, we need to make sure we have a tournament name. we need to make sure that the entry fee isn't something like a negative number. We have to make sure that we have at least 2 teams, because a tournament can't be a tournament with only 1 team. Once all of that is done, we then need to create the schedule. Remember, we talked about the fact that we have that rounds property, which is a list of matchup. We have that rounds property, but we don't have that on the create tournament form because that's not something that the user does. That it gets populated on the click of this create tournament button. First, we'll need to figure out how many teams should be in the tournament. And if you read the companion document that comes along with this course, you'll see I've written out the formula for how to determine how many teams should be in a tournament, and then also how many buys we should have to make up for the missing teams. So for example, if we have 10 teams in the tournament needs to start with 16 teams. So therefore we need to have 6 buys in the first round. And so how that gets worked out is determined in this create tournament button click. It won't happen right behind the button in the code behind, but this is where that logic gets kicked off. We will also then need to randomize the order for the first round. Once all that's complete, then we're really done with this form. So let's move on to the create team form. This form is a little simpler, but let's look at some of the interesting pieces of it. First, the add member button. This is going to take an existing team member from the drop-down list and add it to the tournament player list box on the right. That logic is very similar to the previous form where we had the add team button. Don't forget that when we add the member to the list box, we have to remove that member from the drop-down list and refresh both lists. The next interesting piece is the create member button. What this will do is take those 4 fields above, create a new team member, and add them to the tournament players list box. It will also then clear out those 4 fields. Finally, the create team button will allow us to, first of all, validate this team and then create them. The other thing we'll do is send this information back to the caller. Now, the one thing you may have noticed that's missing on this form, and it's not something that we realized at the previous stage, is that we don't have a delete player button on this form somewhere. We're going to need to add that. And at this part in the process, again, it's really nice to have it drawn on paper because I can just draw it in. But since I don't have it drawn on paper, I'm just going to put it in my notes to make sure to add that. The other thing we'll do is make it the same as the other delete buttons because the users want to see a similar experience across all the forms. That way they get more comfortable with how things work and know what to expect when they see certain things. Okay, moving on, we have the create prize form. And this is even simpler. This essentially is the same as the previous page with just the add new member field or section. So the create prize has 4 text boxes, and when we hit the create prize button, it's going to need to validate the information and then send that information back to the calling form and close this form. And that's all there is to it. The next form is the tournament dashboard. This is really simple. It has a list of existing tournaments. If you select one and hit load tournament, it's going to load the selected tournament viewer for that given tournament. So that's what the load tournament button does. The create tournament button just opens the create tournament form. And that's really all this form does. The only thing that will be different is we'll have to capture when a tournament gets created and put that new tournament in the drop-down for the load existing tournament drop-down. That way, once you create a tournament and the form closes, you can then load that tournament. And that brings us to our last form, the tournament viewer. And this is the fun one because it has a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that makes it a little more complex, but I think we can definitely dive into it and understand the overall view of what's happening in this form. First and very simply, the tournament name will get updated when we load this form. When the form gets loaded, we're going to pass in that tournament object so we will know what the name is. And we'll just put that in this label. Next, we have a drop down with rounds. Now, so far I haven't really highlighted the drop downs. Essentially, you're just loading information from a database or from a text file. But with this dropdown, it's a little different because this is actually calculated. So what's going to happen is we have that list of a list of matchup. And we call that whole object rounds. This dropdown will figure out how many rounds are in a rounds object. I know it doesn't make sense necessarily when you talk about it. You got to kind of see it on paper. But essentially what's going to happen is if a tournament has 4 rounds, we're going to have to put in this drop-down list round 1, round 2, round 3, round 4. And it has to know, go to the list entry for round 1 or round 2. So that drop-down will change what the matchup list box shows. But next, we have the unplayed only checkbox. If this is checked, which I plan having it checked by default, if it's checked, then we will further filter the matchup list box, not only by which round we're in, but also by if the game has been played or not. Next, we have this section over here that displays the scores and allows us to update or change the scores. So based upon who is selected in the matchup list box, that will determine which matchup then gets displayed on the right. First, we'll update the team names, Team 1 and Team 2. And then if they have scores, we'll put those scores in these score boxes. And finally, this score button right here will allow us to change that matchup's scores. And based upon this, it will finalize and say, the matchup is over and this is who won. Now that's where it gets really interesting, because we're going to have to figure out some way of triggering then other things based upon a matchup being scored. For example, if this is the last unplayed game in the round, hitting the score button here should trigger the next round. Remember that we email people when they are scheduled to play. We also email out the results of a round. And if this was the last game in the last round, meaning the championship game, we then trigger the end of tournament information, meaning we then assign prizes and we trigger that final email saying who won, who got what, and what the results were. Now that raises an issue, or at least a question, and that is, can we mark played games with a new score? So for example, say it was a basketball game, and the score for sample team 1 was 95, and the score for sample team 2 was 75. We put those values in and hit score. But then we realize instead of 95 and 75, it was 95 and 82. Can we go back in and update that score? And I think the answer has to be that yes, we can, as long as we're still in the current round. Remember that teams can't play each other until they're in the right round. Meaning, if we know that we're going to play each other in the next round, but this current round's not over, we can't play each other in that next round yet. All the games have to be done in the current round before the next round gets started. So as long as we're in the current round, we can adjust those scores. Because think of it this way. What if sample team 1 was given 95 points and sample team 2 was given 75? But in actuality, we got it backwards. Sample team 1 should have gotten 75 points and sample team 2 should have gotten 95 points. And that changes the outcome of the game. If we were already in the next round, that would change who plays who in the existing round. That could cause some major issues. So I think we need to lock this so that we can only modify scores in the existing round, which means that this score button needs to have logic in it that says, are we in the current round? And that's really it for the tournament viewer. So that raises this question. What are the other pieces we haven't really covered in our logic planning? And we've got quite a few. For example, we haven't really talked about data access. How are we going to access the data, store the data? How are we going to deal with two different data sources that are very, very different? How are we going to email out information? What triggers that? What triggers knowing who plays the next matchup? These are some areas that we're going to dive in when we actually get to the code. We can't plan everything out in abstract. Some things it's just easier to be in the code and then plan. So we've done what we can with our planning outside of Visual Studio. We've created our data design. We've created our UI layout. We have looked at what logic needs to be behind that user interface in order to use and move the data around properly. We're not going to worry about trying to plan out every bit of the other pieces of logic at this point. We'll get to that once we've done all we can to put what we have in code. Welcome to Lesson 6 in a C# from Start to Finish course. My name is Tim Corey, and today we're going to create our class library. So far, we've been stuck in planning mode. And I say stuck because that's how I always feel. That first thing I want to do is start writing code. And as I've stressed, planning is important and it needs to be done before we start coding. But now that we're through our initial planning, we get to actually start by opening Visual Studio today. And today we're going to look at creating our class library based upon what we've already laid out. So let's jump right in. Here we are inside Visual Studio. So we're going to create a new project. We'll select Class Library. We'll name this Tracker Library. And I call it Library at the end to make sure that I know that this is a class library. I'll go ahead and set the location to the location as specified. And the solution name we will call Tournament Tracker. I'll hit OK. And the first thing I do is I open up Solution Explorer and delete Class 1. And the reason I do that is because I don't want anything named the default, like 1 at the end. So instead of trying to rename that and possibly having an issue, I just go ahead and delete that. So now we have our library set up and it's ready for our classes. But what classes do we put in here? And this is the great part about having done the planning process already. We're really not thinking at this point. Instead, what we're doing is we're just retyping what we have in our planning document into actual code. Now, we still are thinking. It's just that our thought process is maybe a little bit different. Instead of thinking, what data do I need? We're now thinking, is that the right name to call it? Am I missing anything? Those type of things. And so it really speeds up the process. So I've got a printed out list of my classes and the properties in them. And so I'll go ahead and start creating those. If you have the companion guide, this is a great time to open that up and go to that page because it really helps you follow along. If not, you can reference the previous videos to see the design for our class layout and compare that to what we're doing right now. Or if you're really organized and had been taking notes, refer back to those. So let's start by adding a new class, and we'll call this Team Model. We could just call it Team if you wanted to, but a standard is to put model at the end of it, just so we know this is a data model or it captures data. It does really differentiate this type of object from anything else. So let's go ahead and just put model at the end of every one of our classes. So Team Model, we'll make it public. And we'll type prop, P-R-O-P. And this is my snippet that I use. It's built into Visual Studio. And this snippet, what it does is if you type prop and tab twice, it creates an auto property. And this auto property is the type of thing we're going to use quite a bit in our classes. This holds one piece of data. So in this case, right now it's an int type, and it's called my property. Of course, we'll change that. We can change that by saying a list of person, and I tab. I can say team members. I hit enter, it goes to the end of the line. Now, we don't have a person class yet. We'll get to that. So for right now, it's a red squiggly. That's okay. Next, I'll type prop, string, team name. So now I have two properties. First is a list of person, and next is a string. And that is all I needed for the team class. Before I continue, the one thing I want to do as well is initialize this team members property. By default, this will be an uninitialized list. And I want to make sure that the very first thing that happens is we initialize it. So what I can do is at the end of the property, say equals new list of person. And this is something new in C# 6.0. It used to be we couldn't do this here. And so instead what we do is we create a constructor, CTOR, tab twice, and then say team members equals new list of person. And that's in the constructor, and so anytime this class is instantiated, it'd call this and it would instantiate the team member's property. But since C#6, we can now just say the auto property equals new list of person. Again, that's yelling at me for the person because it's not yet created. No worries, we'll get there next. So let's go ahead and right click on the tracker library and say add class. And this is the person model. We can say public class person model. I say prop, tab twice, string, first name, prop, tab twice, string, last name, email address, cell phone number, and that's it. So now we have the person model. Notice how quick that went. And I intentionally didn't really talk through the whole thing. I just want to go through it because we've already talked through it initially in our planning step. And now I'm just putting this stuff down into actual code. And the one thing we need to address is back over here in team model, we call this person, and actually person model. I'm going to change this as well. So now we have no more red squigglies. The team model has team members, which is a list of person model. And the person model has our 4 properties. And that's all for that. Let's add another class. And now we add our tournament model. We make it public. We're going to add our string tournament name, our decimal entry fee, our list of team model, entered teams, our list of prize model called prizes, our list of matchup model called rounds. And again, we will initialize these 3 lists. So equals new list of team model equals new. And notice how when I say new space, I kind of glossed over it before, but it already knows list of prize model. And so therefore I say new, and it says right here, list of prize model. So I can say tab and it fills it in for me. Even though right now prize model is not yet a created model. And so it's yelling at me, but at the same time it's saying, you probably want this to be a new list of prize model. So it allows it. Even for that more complicated list of a list of matchup model, it allows it. Now let's continue on and create these other models. Add class, prize model, make it public, int place number, place name, prize amount, and prize percentage. Now leave those all to their initial values. Now if you come back over here to our tournament model, we can see that prize model is now working correctly. So we can add our next class, which is the matchup model. We can make it public. Prop, tab twice, a list of matchup entry model. Entries. And I'll even say right now equals new list. Team model winner. Int matchup round. All right, and the last one I have to do is I have to add a new class for matchup entry model. Make it public. Team competing. Score. And parent matchup. And guess what? That completes the basics of our class library. You see, when you get right down to it, the class library, once it's planned out, is very, very simple to actually build. But before we go, there is one other thing that I want to point out that we really should do. I'm going to start doing it, but I won't show you the whole thing just because it is a little bit long and tedious. And that is, we need to comment this. And I know that's not one of those steps, kind of like planning, that you're like, man, I really don't want to do that, or I'll get to it later. And here's the reality. If you don't do it now, you won't get to it. But I'm not asking you to comment this in general. Instead, what I'm asking for is XML comments. And if you've never used an XML comment before, they're really easy to use, and they're really, really useful. So for example, above this property right here, if I type 3 slashes in a row, 1, 2, 3, it gives me this little bit of XML. And it says summary, and it has a blank line, and then it has the slash summary. If you're familiar with XML or HTML or things of this nature, this right here is an opening tag, and this is a closing tag. Inside here is where you put your actual comment. In this case, I might say, represents one team in the matchup. And then come down here, and again over the score, represents the score for this particular team. And then our matchup model, I would say, represents the matchup that this team came from as the winner. Now that might be a little long, and so I could actually right here hit the enter key and put it on the next line. And notice how it added those triple slash comments and then moved one space over and then started my text. So this is called an XML comment. Now it may just look like a kind of a cool way of formatting, or maybe not cool way of formatting your comments, but there's so much more to this. Let me do a quick constructor here to show you what I mean. Let's say I create a constructor where you have to pass in a double called score, or maybe initial score. Why you do this, not really important. Instead, what's important is this actual method. If I hit triple slash comments here, I get that summary, but I also get this other line saying, here is the initial score parameter. So not only can I document the method itself, but also inside here, and this is where people get some things mixed up a little bit, it's inside like this. And so it's between this greater than sign and this less than sign. Not in here somewhere. Not in here. But you document right there. So not only can I document the method, but also the parameter. And in fact, if this was a method and it had a return type, we could also document that. And if you notice, if you open up your less than sign, I can have examples, or which exceptions get returned, or what permissions are needed for this method, remarks, see also. I can document a whole lot of other things. But again, you may say, who really cares? Or why should I use this format? Well, let's look at, if we had CW tab. Again, console write line, not really pertinent in this location, but pretend that it is. If I look at this right now, I see that it says it writes the current line terminator to the standard output stream. How does that method pass this information along? Well, it's by these / comments. That phrase right there, writes the current line terminator to the standard output stream, that phrase comes from the summary statement. Now, if I were to go down one level, say to this where it says bool value, notice it says value is the value to write. Where does that come from? Well, that comes from the parameter documentation for this item. Again, / comments. And that's what Microsoft does, but we can do as well if we use these same / comments. So if someone is calling this class library, instead of just seeing team competing, which may be descriptive, but this is definitely descriptive, or it should be, in telling you exactly what that is all about. We could even give an example of how to use a certain method, or even say who has access to a certain method or a certain property. So all of these things can be done using our / comments. My encouragement to you is definitely use these. So I'll go back through and add the / comments on the other properties in the rest of these models, but you don't need to watch that. Welcome to Lesson 7 in the C# from Start to Finish course. My name is Tim Corey, and today we're going to be building our forms. Just like with a class library, when we build our forms, we're just going to take the design we already came up with in the planning process and put it into an actual form. You might be tempted to write a bit of code in this step as well, but really we want to concentrate on just building our forms. We'll start wiring them up later. Now, if you remember, the designs we came up with were just rough sketches. In this step, we'll make those forms look good. That means establishing a design guide of some type. I won't bore you with the experimentation I went through to finally come up with my design, but instead I'll just walk you through the end results as we go. Before we get started though, I do want to point out that I am basing all of my work in this video off the designs we did in planning step number 4. If you have the companion workbook, you can refer back to those designs to help you follow along. Otherwise, you can look back at lesson 4's videos to see what our design plans were. So let's get started. Here we have our Visual Studio project as we left it when we built our class library. The only differences are that I did add those code comments on each one of the classes. But that's not really why we're here. Instead, we want to add a new project to this solution. So right-click on the solution, say Add New Project, and we're going to select Windows Form Application. I'm going to call this project Tracker UI. This is a Windows Form application. So Windows Form, Tracker UI, hit OK. Now the first thing it does, it gives us this form1.cs. Now when we create our class library, I said delete that class1.cs and start over, start fresh. We can't really do the same thing inside of the Windows form. And the reason why is because in this program.cs, you'll see that we run right here, form1. So we have to have something here to run in order for it to be a form project. Now we could delete it and then come back here and manually update this, but I find that for forms, it's probably better just to rename it as is right over here. So I clicked and then I clicked again after a second, or you can right click and say rename. We're going to call this the tournament viewer form. And it's going to ask us, since we're renaming this file, would you also like to rename all the references to form1? We want to say yes. So now it renames the class, the partial class tournament viewer form, and also this partial class here, tournament viewer form. And that's what you want. So now the question is, what next? Well, we're going to start right away by modifying some of these properties. Let's actually pull the properties window out, like so. And I call this form, I call it tournament viewer form. But at the top right here, where it says text, it still says form1. I'm going to change this to say tournament viewer. And that just tells us, it changes the text up here to say something besides Form 1. We can change that later if we feel like that's just not a great descriptive name. The next thing I'm going to do is change this back color. This back color is a battleship gray and it's really ugly, especially since most forms use this if they're built inside of Visual Studio. So let's change the back color. Instead of control, we're going to select under web, we'll select white. And that just gives it a little more modern feel. White is a great background color because it doesn't draw the eye away from our stuff on the form. So usually I start with either a white form, or if I'm going to go the opposite, kind of like this Visual Studio window is, I'd go a dark gray. But let's choose white for this. The next thing I'm going to do is change my font. Now it's important to change your font right away on a form instead of later, because every control we add to this form after we change the font will inherit that new font. But any controls that were already on here won't get that new updated font. So if you change it up front, then all the new controls will have it. So let's change this font from the standard, which is Microsoft Sans Serif, to this one. Let's make a 16-point font. That's a nice thin font. It looks a little more modern. And of course that changes the size of our form because of the size of the font. It assumes the form will be a little bigger. We'll shrink that down just a bit. And the only other thing I want to do is I want to change this icon. So let's go to our demos folder, Tournament Tracker UI, and here's this Tournament Tracker icon file. Now, in case you didn't see me create that, which you didn't, or know how I created it, I actually just used the Metro Studio from Syncfusion. It's a free tool that allows me to take simple icons and make them into icon files or PNG files or JPEG files. It's a really handy little tool, and I find it's useful for creating these icon files. I am really not a designer, and so I don't have the tools or the experience and skill to create my own icons from scratch. So it's a great starting point. So I created this little clipboard icon. My thought was that's what I always saw my coach carrying whenever we had a tournament, where he'd keep track of things. And so I figured that'd be kind of a good representation of what this project will do. And so we'll add that icon to every form we create, just to kind of keep a cohesive look. So that's the basics of this form, but don't forget this is actually the tournament viewer form. It has more than just the base stuff. We have to actually add stuff here. So let's start dragging stuff on. So I'll open up my toolbox and pin it. And the first thing is at the top we have here is kind of this header label. And so I'm going to change this for color. Instead of control text, I'm actually going to give a custom color. I'm going to say 51, 153, 255, and that's the RGB code. Well, it has to be 255, not 555. There we go. So now it's that bluish color. And I'm going to change the font on this. Since it is a header label, I'm going to change the font to light 28. So let's go to the font here. And we'll change this to light and 28. Now we'll also change the name of the label. We'll call this the header label. And for the text, we'll say tournament and a colon. All right, that gets us started. And we can rearrange that how you want. I'll get it roughly in place. I may tweak it later, but that's good for now. Now I'm actually going to copy this and paste it. And I just did a Control C. Once it's selected, I hit Control C. And then I hit Control V and it puts a pasted copy here. And that's fine for objects. Just as a quick note, don't do that for forms. That's just a real headache. I actually did that the other day. I was in a hurry and I'm like, oh, I already have all these base settings I want for my other form. I'll just copy and paste the form. It'll be okay. It was a nightmare. you step on toes back and forth between the two forms. They actually kind of get commingled, and it's just ugly. So my quick piece of advice here is don't copy and paste forms. It's physically possible. You can copy here and then just right click in your project and say paste. So it's physically possible, just don't do it. All right, enough of that. You can copy and paste objects like this. So it'll give it a new name, label 1. So let's change that. And this is the actual tournament name. And for now, we're going to just put none. That'd be a good starter name for it. And then we'll move that over a little bit more. All right. Next, we have a drop down with a label. So let's start a label. And I will call this round. And I'll call this the round label. And I will change the fore color again to the 51, 153, 255. I'm going to change the font itself to 20 point. Then I'll line that up, and that should be good for our round label. Now let's get the drop down itself, the combo box. Normally you'd align these with the pink line here. That pink line indicates that the bottom of the label text will be the bottom of the text in the drop down. But because I made the label a little bit bigger of a font, I'm actually going to move this up and use the bottom guide here. So that blue line. And what that indicates is the bottom of the labels box, which is invisible, but the bottom of the box, will be the same as the bottom of the combo box. And that kind of moves the combo box text up just a little bit and makes it a little more centered. Then I will drag this out a little bit, make it a little bigger. Let's call it there for now. I will call this round dropdown. Next, I have to add a checkbox. I'll line that up. And again, I'm going to change the fore color to, you guessed it, 51, 153, 255. I'm also going to change the font on this to be 20 point, because the font actually applies to the equivalent of this label here. I'm also going to change the flat style to be flat, and that will make that checkbox actually turn blue instead of having a black check in it. And the last thing I'm going to do is come down here and change this to unplayed only. And I should also name this. To unplayed only checkbox. Now one thing to note here is I've called this round label, I've called this round dropdown, and I've called this unplayed only checkbox. You don't really have to put the type in there in that name. I like to. One of the reasons why is because this label here really is the same kind of thing as this. They both are for the same thing. This indicates it's the round, but it's the label for round, versus this is the drop down for round. And so putting the type in the end allows me to differentiate, but also when I am searching in IntelliSense, I can actually search for label. And even though it's not the beginning of the word, it will give me all the labels. And that makes my life a little easier if I forget what did I call it. Usually I don't mess with the labels, but I would mess with checkboxes or drop downs or whatever. So let's move that up a little bit. Something like that. So now we have a list box. Be careful to get a list view. It's a little bit different. I've made that mistake more than once, but I want a list box. And one of the reasons why I want a list box is because it behaves very, very similarly to the combo box. These two are basically the same thing with just a UI difference, which makes life a whole lot easier for me because I can treat the two of them in a very similar manner and not get confused on which is which. So there's our list box. I'm going to change the border style to a fixed single. And then the only thing left to do is to actually name it. In this case, it's the matchup list box. So that's half the form. The other half of the form is I have to have a label over here. Let's grab this one right here, copy, paste. Normally I'm not a big fan of copy paste when it comes to coding, but in this case it seems to work pretty well because it brings a lot of those same things along with it, the for color and the font and the flat style and everything else. So I tend to use it for that, but you still need to be careful to name this something different. All right, so this will be team1 name. And again, typically I wouldn't have this say team1 or team2 because I want to have some kind of flexible system where you can have more than two teams, whatever. But we've already talked about the fact that we're only ever going to have two teams competing in a tournament. And so it just makes more sense to have things labeled team1 and team2. Let's go ahead and do that. And we'll call this team1, just so we have something to visualize right here. And then I will copy this and paste it down below. And I will say here, this is score. And team1 score label. And then I'm going to grab a text box. And again, I will line that up at the bottom. And I will call this team1 score text or score value. Let's call it score value. And I will copy all of this and I'll paste it. And since I copied all three, notice how I highlighted that. I'll do it again for you. I clicked and dragged on a form, and notice that little gray outline of a box. This is my highlight window. It's now highlighted three items, this label, and this text box. Now I can Control C on that and Control V to paste, and we'll paste all three of those items together in the same layout and relationship. Then, if I select all of those, and I drag one of the items, say it's label, I can line it up with the other label that is its companion, in this case, this one right here, and now these two are in perfect alignment. Now I just need to go through and change all of these. Let's see, I called this one team1 name, so I'll call this one team2 name. And I called this one team1 score label. So I'll call this one team2 score label. And this one is team2 score text. Just a quick note here, because I was selecting items that had the same property, so this label and this text both have that name in parens property. And actually all items do because that's the name of the object instance. So because they both have these, when I switch between them, it keeps the box kind of highlighted. If you can see there, it's a little bit darker color and it's solid. And what that indicates is the box is really selected. And so if you start typing, and notice I'll select up here where it says team2 name. Now I'm not going to click there. I've just clicked off and clicked in. I haven't clicked there. But if I start typing, notice how it turns blue and my typing goes in that box. That's a quick way to move from item to item, renaming things or setting a text property or other common property between objects. Just select the object and start typing. Let's come down here. We're actually going to change this to say Team 2. Now, last thing we need to do, well, second to last thing we need to do, copy and paste this just so I have a label. And I'm going to change this to say VS for versus. And yeah, I might put a dash in before and a dash after. And I'll kind of center it ish. Make it look pretty good. And I will call this the versus label. Now note, I could use some of these tools up here. There's some tools up here that allow me to align things better. So you can use those to align them the same height or the same relationship with the page. But I'm not going to use that for this little thing right here. It'd probably be a little more complicated than I need to worry about. And the last thing on this page we need to do is add that score button. So come up here. Notice I'm in Common Controls. This is where I really live. Common Controls has pretty much everything you need for 95% of all forms at least. But if you really feel like you have to go beyond that, you could browse around in these other categories or go to all Windows forms and really browse around. Or if you think you know a name of something, you can type it. So for example, I'm looking for a button. Now obviously the button's right here. But if I were to start typing BUTT, it shows me that in all Windows forms, there's a button and a radio button. In Common Controls, there's a button and a radio button. The duplication here is because all Windows forms has all the controls, whereas Common Controls is a smaller subset of that has the most common ones. Kind of makes sense. So there's not two different buttons here. They're the same button. It's just where it comes from. In this case, let's grab the Common Controls button. I'll make this a bit bigger. I'm going to align it more like that for now. But before I go on, I'm going to change this to say this is the score button. And now let's change the flat style to flat. Let's change the flat appearance. We're going to change the border color to silver. We're going to change the border size. We'll leave the border size alone. We'll change the mouse down back color and the mouse over back color. So mouse down back color will be 102, 102, 102. And the mouse over back color will be 242, 242, 242. We can try it out in a minute. And then the font, we're actually going to change it to say semi-bold. We'll leave it at 16. And the fore color we need to change as well. Again, that's the 51153 255. Looks a little better. And now we'll change that to say score. There we go. So there's our score button. And that's pretty much it for our tournament viewer form. So we have our tournament and the name of the tournament. We have the round dropdown with which round we want to view. We can check a box that says only show us the unplayed games in this round. Then we have this matchup list that shows up all the matchups in that round. And then if you select one of them, it's going to highlight and say team 1 is this team's name right here. And their score is this, if they have any score loaded yet. And then again, team 2 and their score, if any. We can also fill in these boxes to give the score and then hit the score button. And that will complete that round for that matchup. And it will say, okay, who won based upon the score. So that's our whole page. Now let's see this in action. But in order to do that, we open up Solution Explorer. And right now the tracker library is bold. That means that it is the project that will be started when we hit this start button. The problem with that is you can't load or run a class library. it isn't an independent project that can be run on its own. So this Tracker UI is the one you want to run. So we're going to right click on Tracker UI and say set as startup project. Now we hit start. And here is the form. Notice it's a little bit different than even the designer looks like. And the reason for that is because this is actually taking the settings from my Windows and applying it to this bar up here and these icons. So these are actually Windows 10 style icons and bar. So that looks pretty good. Also notice the mouse over changes the color of the button a little bit. And if I click on it, it changes to even darker. So that gives us a really clear indication that button was clicked. So that's form 1. Let's move on to form number 2. This should go a bit quicker as we continue to move and as we go over things you've already covered, so I won't have to explain them. So we're going to add a new form. We're going to call it the Create Tournament form. And again, go into the properties. Let's go ahead and pin this. And the text of the form we're going to change to say Create Tournament. The font we're going to change. And then the back color we're going to change as well. We'll change it to white. And that just mirrors what we already have over here. Oh, one more thing, and that's the icon. We'll use that same icon. Now we can do a little bit of shortcut in the fact that if we come back to our Solution Explorer and open up our other form, which is actually open up here, we can come back over here and start copying and pasting. We can actually notice it's already labeled header label. So we can just say Create Tournament. And now that is the right size for label, and it looks just like the label over here. Now we need the tournament name label and text box. So let's grab these two right here. I'm going to copy and paste. I'm going to say tournament name. Tournament name label. And tournament name value. And this is where the user will enter in the tournament name. Let's make it about like so. Next we have the entry fee. Let's align those two there. We'll call this entry fee label and entry fee tech or value. I'll come back over here and say entry fee. Get the alignment right. And that can be smaller. We'll also default that value to 0. Next, we need to have a drop down. Move that up a little bit. We need to have a drop down with a label. So let's grab these two. I'll copy and I'll paste. I'll put it above. I'll line it up like so. And this, we're going to say add team. I'm sorry, select team. The add team label will go next to this label here. So this is the select team label. and the select team dropdown. We'll make this drop down a little larger, about the same size as that text box. It's probably good. Now the next item, the create new team, I debate a little bit on how that should look. And we can definitely discuss this in the comments if you'd like below. But this create new team link, I decided to make into a link label, which by default is this blue color, which I thought about changing to maybe one of our accent colors. But the problem I have with that is if I change it to an accent color, and I have a green accent color I could use, which would stand out, the problem is that we've really been trained with the web that a blue text that's underlined is a link. And it's very obvious you click on a link to go somewhere. We kind of know that. And so to change that coloring to something that would be maybe more in line with our color scheme really would actually have a jarring effect in some ways. So there's a debate there. You can have it. I'm not a designer. I'm not really great at making things look wonderful. So you can kind of figure on your own if you want to do that or not. I'm going to leave it as is. Now let's say create new. I kind of pull that over so it's actually over the drop down. And these don't look quite right. There we go. Looks a little better. So now we have a tournament name, the entry fee, and then selecting a team from a drop down or creating a new team. And then we have a button. This is add team. I'm going to copy that button, I'll paste it in. And I might actually play around with making it wider but flatter. And we'll call this add team button. And that looks pretty good. So I'll copy that and paste it. And then down below, I'll line it up. And this will be the create prize button. And the text will say create prize. Now over here, it's a little bigger, we have a list box. I'll copy that and paste it over. Really didn't need to probably since it's just a list box, but it doesn't really hurt. But I will change this name to call it Tournament Players List Box. And then I will put a label above it and call it Tournament Players Label. And let's actually shrink this up just a bit. You can count the number of rows if you want by how it clicks in. So that's 1 row, 2, 3, 4, 5. We can probably leave it at 5. So team/players. And the other thing we want to do is let's pull this over a little more. We don't need to waste space if we don't have to. There is something I said for having some white space and some kind of breathing room in your form. But at the same time, you don't make it so open and empty that it's hard to see on a screen. It has to be huge in order to be visible. So there's that balance you have to reach. All right, so let's grab, I'm actually going to grab this button over here. I like its height a little better. Paste it over here. And I will put it right here for now. I'm debating if I put it here or if I put it up here. But let's leave it here for now, or maybe I'll even center it a little bit. Just trying to align over there with that bottom. I'm not sure that's right or not. I don't think it is. I'm actually going to select it and hit the down arrow. Kind of make it a little more in line. I could, again, align the middles of these two if I wanted to. In fact, let's see if we can do that. I hit this align middles button right here. And I kind of move this down a little bit, which actually means I need to realign this and then move all of these up to align again with that over there. So it's a whole lot of moving around for just that little bit of twitch, but that's okay. Some people will notice that and be off-put if it's not quite right. It's not me, but that's okay. I'm going to copy this and paste it and line it all up. And I'm going to call this prizes label, prizes list box, and we'll call this delete selected prize button. And you can make these long if you want. The names really should be a little bit descriptive of what they do. I would recommend against abbreviations. Abbreviations are more confusing than they're really worth. We'll say delete selected. And actually move us down a little bit. And that throws the whole thing off, and that's okay, I guess. We should do the same thing here. Delete selected. We called this the delete selected prize button. So we'll call this the delete selected players button. Actually, selected player button. And then we'll make this a little bigger. We'll actually match these up. And it looks like about the same. So now let's make them kind of line up with where they should go, and I think we're good. Looks about right. So now we have their delete buttons, we have our list boxes, we have our labels. The only thing left is a button down here that says, let's give it a name first, the Create Tournament button. And we'll just say Create Tournament. Make it a little bigger, stand out a little more. And there we go. And that is form number 2. Let's move on to form number 3. So we're going to add Windows form, and we'll call this the Create Team form. And again, we'll go to our properties, say Create Team. We will change the icon. We'll change the font. And we will change the back color. There we go. Again, we're going to copy and paste from our previous forms. So we're actually going to copy this header label and this first text box and label right here. So I'll put them up there. I'll call this the Create Team. And this we will say team name. Team name label. And the team name value. And then we will do actually a drop down. So let's grab this right here, and actually the button as well. I'll copy those and paste them, line up the labels, we'll say select team member label, and the select team member dropdown, and the add member button. Add member. Select team member. And down below, we actually had this box around a set of controls. So let's build that. The way I do that is through a group box. Now it's not in the common controls, but if you type for group box, it's either in containers or all Windows forms. So let's drag this on. Now what this does is it puts a visual boundary around our stuff, whatever it is we have on here. Now, there are more benefits than I'm using it for. I'm basically just using it for a good delineation to say, hey, here's a group of stuff that all goes together that's not really connected with the rest of the form directly. It's kind of like a subform almost. So that's all I'm using it for. But there are more uses. You can move the whole group around very easily. And it even has its own label and so on and so forth. But for now, I'm just going to say this is the add new member box. Now, right now, that's our standard font with a standard font color. I am going to change that, but I'm not going to change it until after I put my stuff in here. Now, since I'm copying and pasting, it's not as big a deal. But if I were dragging new stuff in here, it would be kind of a big deal. And the reason why is because anything dragged into here will inherit this item's properties. So I'm not going to change the font size or color until after I've brought everything in. So let's bring in, we have this right here. Let's grab this, Control C, Control V. And I'm going to say first name label and first name value. I will make this a little bigger once I figure out how large this is going to be. First name. That's getting pretty big, so we'll move this over. Actually, make this box a little bigger. I was kind of hoping to keep this small, but I'm thinking this will have to do. We can always go left or right a little more easily on a monitor because typically monitors are in widescreen format. Not all the time, but most of the time anymore, they're widescreen. And so you have more horizontal space than you do vertical space. And so that's just something to keep in mind when you're designing your form. Which way do I want to kind of lean or bend? In this case, I want to kind of make it a little wider instead of making it longer by stacking these on top of each other. I'll copy and I'll paste this. I will say last name. And up here I will say last name label and last name text value. I want to say text because that's one of the ways I sometimes do it, but it really is just a value. And I'm going to paste this again. Let's go ahead and align these and then do another one right away. Now here's the danger in doing two at once. I could easily forget to rename one of these items. And I'll have a label 1 or a label 2 or a text box 1 or text box 2 floating out there. That's not ideal. I really, really don't like to see that. So just be careful when you're copying and pasting. Don't do too much without making sure you go back and rename right away. So I'll call this email label and email value and cell phone label and cell phone value. All right, there we go. And now down here I can say email and cell phone. I can say cell phone number if I wanted to, depending how long that is. That's a little long. Everyone knows what I'm talking about when I say cell phone. I could probably put just cell there or cell number, but cell phone's a little more professional, it seems like. So let's do that. And make that a little larger. I'll Control C and V on this button. And maybe make it a little smaller. Not too much though. And I'll say create member. There we go. And now I'll come back to this, change my font size to the label size, and then the color I will change to my 51153255. There we go. And now I can actually click and drag and bring this up if I want. So I might want to do a little bit of. And then I can actually, if I select one and control and select the other, it selects both for me, and they don't have to be next to each other. Because if I do this, I'm actually selecting the labels too. I don't want that. I just want the items, and so I select one and then hold down control and select the other, let go of control, and now I can drag and move these around as I want. So there we go. So now they're a little larger to match my box down below. And I can even move the add member over a little bit to better center it. And I can also bring all of this up just a smidge to better align with the create team. And now I need a list box on the right, which I can just copy from here and paste over here. Align it like that, so. And then I'll actually make it the same height roughly as this box over here, which in order to make the same height, I'll actually drag it down a little bit and then move my button down. In which case I have a little more space to make my button the same width. So there we go. So now I have the tournament player list box. I'll actually call that the team members list box. So I have a team members list box, which we're going to select team members or add them. In either way, they're going to be added to this box over here. We'll also need a delete button for this. So let's go ahead and grab one of those. Copy, and I'll come over here. I'll stretch my form out, and I will paste that in, and I will roughly center it there. And I will say delete selected member. And then finally we have this button at the bottom, which I'll probably have to scroll just a bit for. And I will say, instead of create tournament, I will say create team. And there we go. And there is the create team form. Now, right now I'm scrolling a little bit, but that's mostly because it's kind of shrunk down into the Visual Studio IDE. And so I can probably, that'll be fine on the page itself, as long as you don't have a small monitor. And that is the assumption here, that the monitor is smaller. But that's a pretty safe assumption these days. So let's move right along to form number 4. Right click on our project, say add, Windows form. And this is the create prize form. The first thing we do is go to our properties. We're going to change that to say create prize. We'll change the icon to be our icon that we're using. We will change the for color. I'm sorry, not the for color. We'll change the back color. Let's change the correct color here. Change the back color to white. We'll change the font. It's 16 point. And now we can create the create prize form. This one's pretty simple. We'll just grab this and we will grab, well, let's do this for now. We'll paste this in. It's still called header label, which is good, but we need to change this to say create prize. And now we need to grab, let's grab actually this one right here. We'll paste and put it right here. Make sure that's aligned. There we go. We'll say that this is place number. Place number label. And this is the place number value. We'll move this over. Now what we need to do is copy this and paste it 3 more times. Those don't look like they're in line. So here we can do. We can come over here and say make vertical spacing equal. And that makes a mess of things. So we hit undo. We select only one of the items. So let's just do the text boxes here and say make vertical spacing equal. Move that one down. And then we'll also say align lefts. Move that one over. And so now we can say, let's move this one right here. And then again, just start aligning all of these based off the first one. That last one does not want to line up. There we go. And then actually we're going to move this one down. So move it straight down to about here. So this is going to be the place name label and the place name value. And this is going to be the prize amount label and the prize amount value. And or this is going to be the prize percentage label and the prize percentage value. Let's go back and change all this text. So that's the place name, the prize amount, and this is the prize percentage. Next, we have to add one more label. So let's just copy this and paste it. That's actually about right. And we'll do the dash or dash like so. And we'll move this around until it's about what we like. And we'll just call this the or label, just to give it a better name. And then finally come over here, grab our create team button and paste this in, put it about the center, call it the create prize button, and say create prize. Looks a little big for this form. Well, you can address that if you want to, but I think that looks okay. And it keeps the same approximate size as all the rest of the create buttons, the big ones. So that leads us to conclude form number 4. We only have one more to go. So let's right click on Tracker UI, say Add, Windows Form, and say Tournament Dashboard Form. We'll go to our properties. By now you should be kind of familiar with this. We say Tournament Dashboard. Let's see if I can get it all right. Tournament Dashboard. We change the font. We change the, I'm sorry, that's the icon. We change the font. I'm getting ahead of myself. I have no clue how to pronounce that. Segoe UI? CGO? I don't know. Whatever it is, it's a cool looking font. And it's 16 point. That's what we want. And then finally, we want to change the back color to be white. That's our form. We'll actually make it a little bit smaller when we're done, but we can start with that. So let's grab the header. And this is going to say, and I actually centered this, so let's first change the text to say Tournament Dashboard. And so you can actually center that if you want. If we want to center that, we just say Format, Center and Form horizontally. That moves it over to center. And then we can say we want to drop down, and so we need to come over here, grab this, we'll copy it, we'll paste it. And if we're going to keep our centering format, we'll do that. So we can center all of these like so. And we can say for this, it is the load existing tournament label. And this is the load existing tournament dropdown. And we'll have a button below that, but first let's change this text. It says load existing tournament. Okay, we'll center these in a minute. I centered them once, and it's every time you change things, they have to be redone. So let's just wait till the end. Now I need a button over here. So I'll take this and paste it in. I'll put it down below here. I'll say load tournament. Load tournament button. And then we have to have that big one. At least that's the design we chose, which is create tournament button. All right, we can kind of move this form around. We can select all of these. I need less space here. Let's drag us down. Move us all up. We can say make vertical spacing equal. That's not really what we want, but instead you want to align the centers. And then shrink that down and maybe even move it up a little more. And then adjust our form accordingly. So there we go. Now we have our last form. This form is going to either select one of the existing tournaments and then load it, or create a new one. Now, the one thing I didn't really point out beforehand, but that I want to go back and talk about, is this idea of, you're copying and pasting and creating all these different items. It's very easy to forget to rename one of them. But if you come over here to the properties And if you do this drop down here, now notice how many things are in here. That's pretty impressive for this little form. But look at all the different names. If you see, group box 1, select it, it selects that group box, and now you can actually rename this to be something more intelligent. Let's say add new member or group box. So that's a great way to make sure that you haven't missed anything in the naming by just looking through here and making sure there's no 1s or 2s or anything that you don't expect to be there. Again, we can come here and very easily go from form to form and make sure that they're all the way they should be. Once we're done, we save them. And actually, the one that we need to change is this form is actually the first form that starts when the project loads. So let's go back to our Solution Explorer. And let's kind of collapse all these forms down and go to program.cs. And where it says new tournament viewer form, we want to say new tournament dashboard form. So now if we run this, I'll bring it over here. This is what starts up. And this is the starting point for our application. Now, in case you're not sure why I did that or how that works, if you're familiar with the console application, we know we have a static void main, and that's where all of our code runs. And once static void main is done, the console closes. Well, a Windows form is basically the same kind of design in the fact that we have a static void main. And that's actually inside of program.cs. That's right here. And once this method is done, the application closes. And so we have these 3 lines of code. The most important one for us, since these are basically saying just do what Microsoft's already set up. But this last one here says application.run new tournament dashboard form, which creates a new instance of a tournament dashboard form. But what that does is it actually pauses the application right here. At least it pauses this thread or this method, and it says don't end this line until this instance right here closes. Which is why when we start this up, we're running this form right here. If we ever close this form, the application closes, even if we have other forms open. So that's just a quick tip. You probably already knew that, but I wanted to point that out just to make sure. Also note this right here, XML code comments, something that Microsoft did, not us. But it's just one more indication that yes, you should be using XML code comments. And in fact, when we come back through all of these projects, these forms, and view their code, we'll actually add our own XML comments to all of our methods that really need it. Anything that's being called outside of that form. So that's it. That is our form design project. That's really all there is to it. We went really quick in some ways, and in some ways it took a little long. But mostly the reason it took so long is because we actually talked through why we do things and how we do things and those kind of things. But the actual form creation process, once we got through the first couple and we covered all those topics, went really quickly, especially when we're copying and pasting. That made life a little easier for us. Welcome to Lesson 8 in the C# from Start to Finish course. My name is Tim Corey, and today we're going to look at our SQL database design. Originally, I had planned to go into logic design directly and assumed that you understood where the data came from. But after thinking that over, I decided that we should at least look at the design and structure of a database and then go from there. You could consider this a bonus video since it's not really about the C# project, but it is kind of important to understand if you're going to build this on your own. Now, if you aren't familiar with SQL, this video isn't going to be a comprehensive overview. I'm actually developing a start-to-finish series on Microsoft SQL databases that should be out shortly if it's not already. Instead, today I'm going to walk you through some of the basics on how I built this database. Everything is scripted out, so if you purchase the upgrade for the course, you'll get all the scripts along with the items in the package. So let's jump right into our diagram. So here we have our database diagram, and it looks a little complex, but don't worry, it's not that complex. What this is just showing us how all the different tables relate to each other. And I bring this up not to scare you away or to just confuse you, but instead I want to point out a couple of things. Again, I'm not teaching you all about SQL today. I'm just giving you the overview. But I do want you to understand how this is designed and how you really should be thinking about a design for a database. So for example, let's look at the team members right here in the middle. Notice that this is being a list of all the members for a given team. But you don't see a person here, first name, last name, all the rest. You see a person ID. And that links back to the people table with its ID. And notice the link right here. This is a one-to-many relationship. And so in the people table, first name, last name, email address, and cell phone number are all listed as columns. So you could have a person in the people table with an ID of 1. And you could reference that person more than one time in the team members table. The benefit of that is the same person could be on more than one team. For example, if there's 2 different tournaments going on at the same time, it makes sense that the same person is on 2 different teams. Or if a tournament has closed or ended and the next tournament has started, you wouldn't want to recreate that person, but instead just use the same person and add them to the next team. So the idea here with our design is that we don't store a whole bunch of information that gets duplicated. Duplicates are really bad in a database environment. And the reason why is because if you have a duplicate record, chances are you'll update it in one place but not the other. And then you have conflicting information and which one's right, and you're not sure. Because if my first name is Tim and last name is Corey, and my email address was tim@corey.com, but then somewhere else in the database it said Tim, Corey at tim.com, which one's right? It's hard to see. And so this setup right here tries to minimize duplicate information by always using IDs instead of the actual person or actual object. So just note, whenever we try and store information, we try and store it in as tight a formation as possible, meaning we don't have as more columns as we need to. For example, if I were to say, you know what, we're going to have at least 1, but maybe 5 email addresses for people, I wouldn't add 4 more columns for email address 2, email address 3, email address 4, and so on. Instead, I would then create a new table over here called email addresses. And then I would have a column for person ID, which would be this right here, and then a column for the email address. And that way one person could have 1 email address or 5. But in this case, I'd say, you know what? We're only going to capture 1 email address and 1 cell phone number, and that's it. So therefore, it makes sense to put them here so we don't make our database design more complicated than it has to be. And that's the balance we always play with when we're developing a database design. So this is it. This is our database design. It should hold all the information we need. So we have the tournament information, the prizes, the entries, the teams, the matchups, the matchup entries, the team members. That should be basically what we need for our entire database. But, you know, especially when you're designing these things, not really on the fly, but you're designing as you go. Usually you forget something. And so I'm actually building this course in a way that takes you through those kind of decisions. So that when we get down the road, you might find out, oops, we didn't include something. How do you put that in? Because that's real world. The real world is you never get something fully planned out before you have to put it into code. And so how do you take those modifications after the fact and put them into place? And so we'll do that with this database as well. Now let's turn it over to the SQL Server Management Studio. And that's here right now. Okay, so this is the SQL Server Management Studio for Microsoft SQL Server 2016 Developer Edition. Now what I love about this is the Developer Edition is free. You can go to Microsoft's site and download it. But yet, the Developer Edition has all the same power as Microsoft's Enterprise Edition SQL Server. Now, Enterprise Edition is really expensive for a developer or a single person to buy. But we don't need to put anything in production, because that's the one limitation this database has, is we can't use it in production. But for development purposes, it's free to use. So if you were in a corporate environment, you could develop in this and then push the changes to your quote-unquote real production server without an issue. In this case, we just need something for testing and for developing our application, and this will work just great. If you're not familiar, over here on the left, I've connected to my instance of SQL Server. You can actually have more than one instance of SQL Server on your machine at any one point. In fact, this right here is the ./SQL 2016 instance, which means that it's not the primary or default instance on my machine. Typically, the default is just the dot. And so this is actually the named SQL 2016 instance on this machine. And the reason why is because I also have an instance for all of my work development, which of course I don't want to give away to the world. So in here, I have one database, the Worldwide Importers database. That's actually from Microsoft. They give you a sample database to play with, and you can download that by Googling it, Worldwide Importers Sample Database. But today we're actually going to create our own database. Now, there are a couple ways of doing that. First, you can right-click on Databases and say New Database. And it brings up this dialog and has a whole bunch of options here. But here's what I find, especially for a development machine. You don't need to deal with all of this stuff. Okay? Now, you could just fill in a name here. So if you wanted to, I typed in tournaments and hit OK, that would use the defaults for everything. Now there is here, this is the actual data file. And so you can set some defaults here, like the initial size, how large it will grow, at what size, and to what maximum size, and then where that's located on the disk. Now, if you're an actual DBA, you'd want to change this path location because you want to get the most speed you can out of your disks. And so typically what you do is you'd put your data file, that's right here, the data file, on one drive, and then your log file on a different drive. Now, we're not going to do that today. We're not going to worry about any of those kind of defaults because this is just for development, not for production use. Now, that's one way of doing it. You just hit OK, you're done. But I'm going to show you a different way. If you go to New Query, this right here is the query window, and it's the place where you should probably spend most of your time as an entry level or even through advanced SQL developer. I find that it's much, much quicker just to do things here than it is to try and mess around with the GUIs for most things. And I'll show you an exception in just a minute. So to create a database, you simply say, and I'll tab down here, and I'll say create database tournaments. Now notice the semicolon at the end. That's one of the newer things in SQL Server, and by newer I mean I believe it came in around 2008 maybe. So newer as in 8 years ago probably. But it's something that is usually left off by developers just because we forget it. But it really should be added to the end of every statement. Not the end of every line, the end of every statement. So create database tournaments. And if I hit execute, that says command completed successfully. This message window down here is where you see the results when you have results. You come back over here, you don't see the database yet, but if you hit the refresh button when you're on databases, it now shows the tournaments database. And if you open that up, you'll see database diagrams, tables, views, and all the rest. And if you open up tables, there's nothing in there. That's because it's a blank database. Let's go ahead and change that. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to run all of my table scripts since writing scripts is really boring. But then I'll come back and show you how to create a table and then also how to create a table script. I'll be right back. And I'm back. Okay, so I've created now all the tables using my script that I will need for this database. Now let's take a peek at one of them just to see how a table is constructed, and then I'll build a sample table for you just to show you the process that I go through. So let's look at prizes. I'm going to right click and go to Design. And the nice thing about the Design view is it shows us an editor for editing our tables instead of having just the SQL script. The SQL script can be a bit daunting. In fact, let's go ahead and look at the SQL script for this prizes. There's a SQL script. That's a lot of script, okay? And even remembering just this part, which is all we really need to worry about, this up here is nice, but not necessary necessarily. But even just this much is a little intimidating, especially when you're a C# developer, not a SQL developer. Because C# developers have to do some database work usually, but that's not our primary love. And so if we can get away from this, if at all possible, we probably want to. And that's where this designer comes in. This designer really makes things easy. So what I have here is my ID column. These are the column names right here. And so let me see if I can zoom in on that for you. There we go. So here's our column names. So my ID column, which I call ID, and that's a standard that I have. You don't have to have that standard, but I call it ID, and then anywhere else I typically call it prizes ID. So that's an integer column. That's the data type. So these right here are data types. That's what you're familiar with when it comes to SQL. It's just they're named a bit differently. So my ID column is first. It's of type int. It does not allow nulls, meaning you have to put a value in there. And then this key right here indicates that's the primary key. And the way you mark that as a primary key is over here, you'll see this little key icon. And you click that to add, or in this case, remove the primary key from that column. And what a primary key does is it says, this is what we're going to order all the rows by. And why this is important is it allows SQL to optimize the database or optimize the table. If we don't have this, SQL does what's called a heap. And it's basically just what it sounds like. It just throws rows on top of the heap. But then every time we want to look for a row, it has to go sorting through that heap as if it was a garbage dump. Now, this is a key that we create. And in fact, this column right here, ID, I set as an auto-incrementing column. If we zoom out here and come down here, I'll pull this up. And down here in the identity specification for this column, we have, yes, it is an identity, and the identity increment and seed. The increment is how many we count up by. So in this case, 1. And the seed is the starting number. So the very first item is going to be number 1. And the next one will be 2, and then 3, and then 4. Which makes sense. We're just going to count up. But what that does is it gives us a unique identifier for every row in our table that SQL will sort by. That also means when we add a new row to our table, it knows immediately to add it to the bottom of our table because it has the highest number. You see, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes when it comes to a table and how it stores information. And we want to make sure that we optimize our tables for most efficient storage and retrieval. And this seems to be the best way of doing that, creating this ID. Now, there will be obscure edge cases where that's not the case. But, and here's the deal, you're a C# developer, probably. If you are, and you're building databases, it's not because you need to build the most totally optimized database on the planet. You need to build a good, really good database. And this is the way of doing it. If you have your SQL developer friends say, hey, this is a much better way of doing it, which there isn't a much better way, but maybe a little better way of doing it, tell them, great, go ahead and build me one. But this is the way that gets you the 98% of the way towards optimized for about 2% of the effort. So go ahead and do that. The next thing is the place number. Again, it's an integer. That's for our prize, it's going to be first place, second place, third place, but just the number. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, we don't allow nulls. The place name. Now this is a little bit interesting here, and I want to point this out for a minute. This is where you put the place text. So first place, F-I-R-S-T space P-L-A-C-E, first place. So we need to have a text field of some kind. In C#, that'd be a string field, real simple. But in SQL, where it's all about data, we have to optimize for what type of string do we want. Now, there's a few different string types in SQL. There's nvarchar, that's nvarchar max. There's varchar, right down here, and there's other types as well. But in our case, I have chosen nvarchar. And the reason for that is because this is the type that best fits my data. Now, what an nvarchar is, it has three distinct parts right here. The n, the var, and the char. So let's start with char first. Char means a character. So it stores characters, meaning any kind of character you want. Numbers, letters, special characters, they all fit in here, spaces. Var means a variable length, meaning this number right here, 50, is the maximum number of characters that this column will hold. But var means that it could hold 3 characters, 5 characters, or 50 characters. Now it can't hold 51, but it can hold 50, 49, 1, or even 0 characters. That's what the variable means. The counterpart to that, it does not have the var there. It's just nchar or char. And what that does is it says we'll always have 50 characters, whatever that maximum number here is. And so how it gets away with that is if you store, say, a string of 5 characters, it's going to pad that string with spaces afterwards. So it's going to have the 5 characters you gave it plus 45 spaces. All right? And there are times when that's useful, but typically I find that it's not useful, again, for about 95% of the times when I want to store text. So I always default to varchar or nvarchar. And that brings us to this n. The difference between varchar and nvarchar is the type of characters it can store. A varchar, without the n front, can store just the typical ASCII characters. But the nvarchar stores Unicode characters. Now, Unicode takes up twice as much storage space in your database, but the benefit of it is that it allows for other languages' characters. Now, I'm in the US. I typically deal with US English characters, and so if I were dealing with just US characters, I would do varchar for practically everything. But if you are dealing with an international audience, or you're dealing with the option to have international characters for certain things, you want to have this nvarchar. And so that's the difference. You'll see me use both kinds in this database. And that's because of whether I thought that I would be providing the strings or the end user is providing the strings and what type of strings they are. So that's the decision to make because it does, again, double your storage capacity or storage space taken up by this data. And when you're getting into millions of rows, storage space is important. Again, we probably won't get a million rows in this project, but you know what? you want to plan for as optimized as possible right up front. Best practices. Okay, so we can change this number here if you want to, up to, I believe, 4,000. But there's also the option here of nvarchar max. And that's a bit different. Max will hold a ton of data. It's actually handled a bit differently than the nvarchar because that max data is not actually stored with your row. Now, when you access it and use it in the database, it's connected and it doesn't look like it's any different. But in the back end, it's actually stored a little bit differently in order to allow for some optimizations. And that the max field will be for when you're going to allow the user to type a book. I mean, lots of information or other types of data. One of the places I use that is if I'm storing a JSON string in my database to be used in my front-end web application, I'll usually do an nvarchar max. That way I can store a very, very large JSON string without a problem. Okay, we have the prize amount. Now, just like C#, where we have the decimal versus the double, in SQL we have that same differentiation. So the prize amount is dollars and cents if you're in the US, and probably something similar, or at least as similar as far as the actual numbers is concerned in other places in the world. So we have what's called a money column. And that is that precise column, that decimal type in C# is probably the closest equivalent. But then down here I have the prize percentage, which is just a percentage. Think a number between 0 and 1. So, 0.28, 0.83, whatever. Therefore, that is a float. And that's the equivalent of a double in C#. So that's a table. That's how you create it. There's a few more things to look at. The biggest thing is the relationships. So back on the diagram, we saw that the tables were all kind of connected to each other based off of these ID numbers. And in fact, if you remember back in the diagram, or if you have the companion booklet, you can back and flip back to it. We have this ID field right here, the prizes ID, connected to the tournament prizes table. And how we do that? Well, right up here, I know it's kind of small, but let's zoom in here. This icon right here, it says relationships. Now, if you're dealing with a previous version of a SQL Server Management Studio, you'll see the icons are a bit different. In fact, this used to be a yellow icon. It might still be. Nope, it's not. So it used to be a yellow icon, but it's not anymore. And this is a little bit different. But if you mouse over it, it says relationships. It's the same one. So we're looking for relationships here. And we get this. This is our relationships editor. So what we do here is we say these two tables are connected. In this case, we have one relationship. We have the prize ID to tournament prizes table relationship. And if I come over here to tables and column specifications and click the ellipsis, all right, the foreign key table is the tournament prizes and the column is prize ID. The primary key table is the prizes table and the column is ID. Now it's, again, terminology is sometimes difficult to get through, but think of it this way. The primary table is the one that actually has the quote-unquote real ID. That's the ID we just created that says this is the unique row, okay? Think of it as row number 5. How does that relate to the tournament prizes table? Well, in the tournament prizes table, there may be more than one entry that has 5 for the prize ID. So therefore, the tournament prizes table is the foreign table. So primary is the one that has it just as ID. That's the primary table. The foreign table is the one that uses that ID. So what this does is it links these two columns together and says, okay, these two columns are related. They're the same data. So when I say 5 over here, I mean the record over here in prizes that has an ID of 5. Now you can get into some really fun relationships. I didn't in this database, but what you could say is enforce replication. And you can say what happens when an insert or update happens. So I could say if I delete an entry, what happens? I can cascade that delete. And so what that'll do is it'll keep my two tables in sync. For example, if I delete a prize, then I shouldn't have that prize ID used anywhere. And so I can replicate then, go ahead and delete all the records where 5 was used. Or I could set them to null or default. And the same thing with update, I could update the information here. So for example, if I were to change the ID in the prizes table, it would then update everywhere it said 5, it would now have a new number, which don't change your IDs. Let's just get down to the bare facts here. Don't change your IDs. Think of them as unchangeable. Okay, so that's relationships. Tell you what, let's go ahead and close this out and create a new sample table. Again, we could do the create table right here, like that, and keep going, but that's really complex and not something you need to worry about. Instead, right-click on table, say new table, and then just start filling it out. So I start with ID. I apologize, this is so small. Not much I can do with this editor right now. So I say ID, and then I choose int for the type and uncheck this allow nulls, and come over here to the set primary key button to add that as a primary key, and then expand down here the identity specifications. I double click on the no of is identity. Saying that to yes also changes these two to the default values of 1 and 1, which is exactly what I want, so that's good. Now let's create a table that stores, I don't know, person information. So let's create a first name. No spaces in the column names, don't do that. Just like with variable names, just don't do it. I'm going to change this to an nvarchar. And a person's name, 50 is the default value. There may be a time when 50 isn't long enough. I'm thinking probably not the first name, but you really don't want to have to mess with this later. So let's put it as 100. And I'll say, no, you're not allowed to have nulls. Then last name, it's nvarchar. Again, for sure, 50 is not long enough for all names because don't forget, people hyphenate their last name. So if they had a long last name and they hyphenated it, you don't want to, as a database developer, be rooting for their hyphenated name to include Jones because it's short. You want to make sure that you have enough space for them. So let's make sure you just give it 100. The nice thing about the variable character is even though we can hold 100, if we only use 5 characters, then the other 95 aren't stored. So it actually makes our tables a little more flexible and small. So you still want to put some limits there, but you do have the option then of giving a little more buffer to your items. All right, node and allow nulls. Let's do an email address. Again, nvarchar. This one's a little trickier because I believe the actual limit here is 2,000, and that's really big. But I believe that's the limit that's put on email addresses. The reality is no one has, or practically no one, has a 2,000 character email address. But you should make sure that you have plenty of space for even extreme examples. So I wouldn't do 2,000. You could even have something on the website or whatever application you're using. say, that's just too long, pick a different one, use a different one. Email addresses are free, or practically so. So we can definitely specify something shorter. Let's go with, let's make it 200. That seems reasonably long. And then let's add a phone number. And just like with C#, this should probably be a text character. But in this case, I don't think we need to have the N for nvarchar. We don't need Unicode characters, probably, since they're typically numbers. And so let's just do a varchar, and we will make it a maximum of 20. Now, the phone number, maybe we don't have phone numbers for everybody, or don't want to require that, so we can allow nulls for that. And then let's create another column. This column we'll call number of kids. And so we'll do an int. We're not going to allow nulls here, but we're going to put a default in. Now, probably my guess is that if we looked at every person in a reasonable group of people, the default number of kids would be 0. Because the people who aren't old enough, who aren't in a relationship or haven't been yet, as well as people who haven't had kids or whatever. So, and again, this is just an example, but we want to have a default value here instead of null, but we don't want to fill it in every time. We can put a default value right down here where it says default value or binding, and we'll set that to 0. All right, and it puts it in parens. Now it's default value when we create a new record. All right, add one more. The create date. And there's actually a couple different dates and times and other things in here. There is date, date time, and date time 2, and then date time offset. I choose to use date time 2, and here's the reason why. Date is just the actual date, not a time as well, which for a create date for this row isn't good enough. Date time is the old standard for storing date and time. Date time is the new standard. So use a new standard, there's a reason for it. And then I don't need to store the date time offset. So let's store the date time 2 here. I will uncheck the allow nulls, but then down here for the default value or binding, I'm going to put get date time. And that throws an error. I want to cancel my changes. It's actually get date. There we go. Get date. I have a hard time switching between SQL and C# sometimes. So get date will get the system date and time for this unit. So wherever the SQL server is running, that's the date and time it gets. Now, if you were dealing with any kind of overlap between different time zones, it's a much better thing to do a get UTC date here. What UTC date will do is it will get the date and time with a time zone modification of 0. So that way, no matter where you are in the world, it's always the same time when it comes to relationships. So if I was using this database in California and then somebody else used a database in New York, they might have the same time, but because it's different time zones, it's actually 3 hours difference. And so this get UTC date would eliminate all of that. And it's usually not a problem, but in case it is, that UTC will really save your butt. So just note that if you're dealing with any kind of crossing the date line where maybe you have a SQL database on the East Coast and one replicated on the West Coast, and you use both of them, that would be a problem. So in that case, get UTC date. But especially for desktop applications, that's not a big deal because you're dealing with local databases usually. In that case, get date works just fine. And I'll leave get date in. Okay, so that's it. Let's go ahead and save this. And I will call this test person table. So test person. And now I can say from my query editor, let's go ahead and refresh this over here. If I were to say select star from test person, notice it's going to yell at me because I don't know who that is. If I do Control-Shift-R, that should refresh my well, it should refresh my window. It's not. That's okay. So what I can do is close it out and open up a new query window. Select star from test person. And now it's updated. And I can hit F5 and see there's no records in my table. And we'll get back to the query syntax in a minute. But I can also right-click on my test person table. I can go design if I want to look at it again. Or I can say select top 1,000 rows, which will essentially give me just what I saw here. Only if there's more than 1,000 rows, it only gives me the first 1,000. Or we can say edit the top 200 rows. Now this works great because it shows us a new editor and we can enter stuff in right away. Let's just enter Tim, Corey, test at corey.com, 555-1212. I can put a dash there. Number of kids, I'll leave number of kids and create date blank. So right now it's yelling at me. I have not put anything for ID and I have not put anything for number of kids or create date. But I filled in all the other fields. So if I hit down here, it actually creates that record. And if I were to hit the Execute SQL button by right-clicking the white space and saying Execute SQL, or by coming over here to this button right here where it says Execute SQL, a little green play button, it's going to refresh this. And notice now my ID is 1, my number of kids is 0, and my create date actually has a date in there. And that's great. Now if I wanted to, I could come over here and say 2 kids, and I mouse off it, and that works. But if I try and change this to be 15, 4, nothing. So the reason why is because I cannot modify the primary key when it's an auto increment field. And that's by design. There is a way to get around that, but don't. Just don't. Okay? So also notice that if I were to not fill in a field where I should have, notice the first name is not filled in, it's still null. Email address is hello@world.net, 555-1234. I'll leave the rest blank. If I mouse off it, it says no rows were updated. The data in row number 2 was not committed. And the reason why is because we cannot insert a value of null into the column first name. And so the insert has failed. Now, it allows it to come back here and modify this. If I didn't want to modify, if I want to destroy the row, I can hit escape. But in this case, I'll just put Jim and then mouse off it, and that works. If I hit my play button here, notice it now has a 3 for the ID, not a 2. The reason why is because we generated a 2 when we tried to enter the null for first name, last name of Smith. It didn't work, but it still held on to that ID number and said, nope, can't use that. Now, some of you may be saying, oh no, I need to get that back somehow. No, just leave it alone. Let it go. it's better that it's gone. You want to keep with the normal system that SQL does for auto-incrementing your fields. It will not hurt anything, and it will be helpful in some instances. Okay, so we've entered some rows here. A couple things to note. This editor right here edits the top 200 rows. Okay, when I said edit top 200 rows, which means that if you have 300 rows in your table, you will only see the first 200. That can be very confusing, especially if you're adding new rows and then refreshing and they disappear. They're actually there, it's just that they're below the 200 line. They're 201 or below. That can be really confusing. I've bumped into it a couple times, and there are other ways of inserting and updating rows, but it comes down to manual SQL scripts. They're not as bad as it sounds, but it's a little more complex than I want to teach you today. However, one more thing I want to show you is back here I did this select star from test person. If you're not familiar with the SQL script syntax, actually the first thing that you should be doing is thinking about where you're pulling information from. So what I always do is I just say select star from, and then I put my table, and I'll go back and change my columns if I really want to. In this case, star means every column. Now, when you're actually creating SQL scripts and you're optimizing them for best performance and all the rest, you don't put star. Because there's a few reasons. I won't get into the whole list of them. Basically, a true SQL, developer or DBA will probably yell at you for a select star. But again, for 95% of your cases, it's probably fine. So select star is probably fine. That just gives us every column. And then since there's no limiters here, it'll also give us every row. Now, when I right click, it says select top 200 rows. How do you do that? Well, select top, 1000. Select top 1000 star from test person. We only have 2, so it's not going to make a difference. But that would limit us if we had 1,000,000 rows in this table. Whenever you're dealing with big tables, always make sure that when you're testing things out or trying queries, limit those things down to a few hundred rows. Okay, so I just hit the execute or F5, and I got my 2 records back here, my ID of 1 and 3, first name of Tim and Jim, last name of Corey and Smith, email addresses, and so forth. What else can I do with this? Well, we can also do a filter. So where last name equals Corey. Notice it's single quotes, not double quotes. So single quotes around Corey. What will that do? It gives us just the Tim Corey record. Now, if you said, well, I'm not sure I know the full name, but I know part of the name. Not a problem. Where last name like COR %. And that's the wildcard character for, I don't know. We run that, get the same results because COR %, Corey fits in those parameters. Now, if I didn't have that % there, it's not going to find anything because last name like, without a %, it's essentially saying equals COR. So we need to use that %. Also, unlike C#, if I were to type all lowercase COREY and execute this, it still finds Corey with the uppercase C. So C# would not have found that because lowercase COREY is not the same as uppercase C, lowercase OREY. So SQL is not dependent on case. It's case insensitive. All right, so there's the select top 100 or 1000 star from test person where last name equals Corey. If we take that out, now we can take it out by either deleting it or 2 dashes in a row makes it a comment. And I can continue on and say order by, let's do a first name. So select top 1000 star from test person, order by first name. This is skipped because it's been commented out. And there you go. If you want to add that back in, we take the comments out. And now it's going to order, but because we only have one record, we really can't see if it's ordered correctly or not. But it is.